Imagine sleeping peacefully, only to wake up in a nightmare dungeon. No overpowered magic, no legendary sword, just 6 wobbly legs and giant monsters eager to make you their next snack. Welcome to Anthony's new life, where he must dig, hide, and shoot acid out of his rear just to survive day 1. As he wakes up, he tries to understand where the hell he is. Turns out he just died. The last thing Anthony remembers is casually reading a book in the comfort of his home, and now he's stuck in this endless white void. If this is heaven, then where's the swimming pool and the all-you-can-eat buffet? He then gets another system message saying that he will soon awaken to experience life again in a new world. His guide there will be Gandalf himself, who says that Anthony will be reborn into the magical world of Manga, where destiny and luck will determine his fate. He'll start with some initial stats that seem pretty solid on paper. Anthony even hopes that maybe he'll be strong like the main character in his favorite video game, but a more detailed rundown lists his skills as digging, acid shot, grip, and bite. Even more shockingly, his species identification lists him as a hatchling worker ant. Anthony just can't believe he's going to be reborn as an ant. If his mana is non-existent, then he can say goodbye to the dream of being a sorcerer. Gandalf has some explaining to do, and his skills rundown is just weird. There's the bite. Then there's the much more bizarre acid shot. Where the hell are his overpowered main character skills? The most alarming thing of all is being listed as a hatchling worker ant, a formica. He'll not only be reborn as an ant, but a newly hatched worker ant at that. Maybe Anthony royally screwed over someone in his past life, so Gandalf and the system are punishing him. But that's impossible. He barely had any connection to other people in the past. Judging by his empty bookface inbox and his crippling introversion, he is painfully reminded that he didn't have any friends or any other meaningful connections. Gandalf urges him to go forth and forge his own path. Maybe it will be the ant's path. If that's the case, then Gandalf can just go and forge his mother too. Wholly unprepared for what's to come, the gruff voice starts counting down for the initialization of the soul transfer. 3, 2, 1. It feels like everything goes mute when the count finishes. Soul transfer has been successfully completed, and with it comes the booting of the hatching process. Anthony is thrust into a bizarrely uncomfortable position. His body feels weird. It feels like being squeezed in from all sides as he shakes fervently. He wasn't fully buying all the text boxes from earlier, but he's really being reborn as an ant. It's really happening. Surveying his frail new body, he feels 6 legs. That's 1 check for the ant body checklist. 2 antennae are present. His strong mandibles are fully functional. Counting from his head to the end of his abdomen, he counts 3 distinct body segments. He used to have pet ants and now he's become one as well. It sounds like a weird nightmare scenario. Not to mention the poor lighting conditions. It's darker than a moonless night in his current location. Everything's pitch black, and it's not helping that his vision is as blurry as can be. But upon walking for a little bit, Anthony starts seeing something faint and blurry. Behind the light at the end of the tunnel, there is something blue. Fortunately, he can still see colors. Aside from that, he wonders what else he is capable of. Maybe it's time to use his new anatomy to its full potential. Sensing the environment using his antennae feels weird, but he can feel unidentifiable smells and air currents ahead. The standout smell is the scent of staleness, which indicates that he must be underground. But if he's an ant, then isn't he supposed to smell pheromones? With no pheromones to sense, where are his brethren? The colony. Anthony has been given a second chance in life, and he doesn't want to be a loner in this one too. Upon walking for a few more minutes, he starts catching on to a scent similar to his own. Maybe a new comrade is waiting at the other side of the tunnel. He just needs to follow the blue pulsating light while hoping that nothing bad happens as he reunites with an ant brother. His excitement grows the closer he draws to the exit. He excitedly scurries to meet a fellow ant buddy, determined to assist in whatever task they'd need for the glory of the colony. But his arrival at the end of the tunnel does not go as he expected it would. His new comrade looks like he is in deep trouble as he flies through the air against his will. On the other side is an abominable beast, grinning happily with its sharp teeth on full display. Densely packed muscles are contained under a strong layer of rough scales. It's the stuff of nightmares for someone as small as Anthony the ant. With the possible comrade neutralized, the reptilian beast is free to predate on its prey while smugly crunching away. It doesn't even eat the ant in one go. It bites the poor guy's body into pieces first. Anthony starts panicking. He's just a guy who loves ants and books. He didn't sign up for whatever this is. As much as he would like to refuse that this is really happening, this is his reality now. Ants getting chowed down and trampled by monsters. The other ant, trapped under the monster's feet, looks at him with pleading eyes, and it feels like a wake-up call. What can a single ant even do in his position? Well, there's just one thing that comes to Anthony's mind. It's his only move. It's to run as fast as his newly hatched 6 legs can possibly move. Run like his life depends on it. Because it does. Running for the first time in a new body, he is clumsy as hell. He even trips and falls face first. After running for a long time, he should have escaped the territory of that monster by now. But what if another one casually waltzes down this tunnel and spots him as a quick snack? His only way of survival is to throw away his human conventions and think like an ant, as if by instinct he knows what he has to do. Dig. Dig as hard as he can. It's one thing to know what an ant would do, but it's another to execute it. His legs are not cutting it, he is just scratching the ground. That's when Anthony remembers his time observing his pets. Ants use their mandibles to dig, so he basically needs to dig the ground using his face. Without wasting another second, he immediately buries his dependable mandibles in the rough surface and starts munching on dirt. Now, this is what you call digging. He makes more progress in just a few seconds using his face compared to using his legs for a few minutes. After digging to an appropriate depth, he carves out a spherical space with plenty of room to move. With a new base camp established, Anthony the ant can finally lie on his back after a hard day's work. He's safe for now, but getting spotted by other animals would be a death sentence. How did he even get to this place in the first place? It hasn't even been a full day, and he has already encountered a fearsome beast. New ants should be born inside a colony, protected and surrounded by allies. Judging by the fate of his poor fellow ant up in the reptiles' territory, things are messy. He might not be the only one dropped into these hopeless straits, which means that a raid is afoot. With a bit more time to think, Anthony remembers that Gandalf the system said something about a skill point and biomass. The world that Anthony now inhabits is a mystery. The descent of the system resulted in the civilization's hefty gains, but they can no longer recall what they've lost. Back to Anthony's dilemma. He currently has 1 skill point and 1 biomass to spend. He has to make it count. If this is a game-like situation, there should be some sort of menu screen he can access. At first, he tries raising his legs and screaming level up into the air. Not only does it not work, but he also looks like a fool, too. Another idea crops up in his mind. Maybe this one will do the job. He resolutely swipes in the empty space in front of him and yells, "Status open!" as loud as he can, and it works. A very interesting text prompt appears in front of him. He still can't tell if his stats are high or low, but regardless, he can see them freely now. At the Skills tab, he sees Grip. Maybe it means that he'll be able to hold on to things pretty well. In its description, it states that grip is the ability to hold on to surfaces and objects without letting go. An example of its application is the ability to walk across walls. Anthony's eyes sparkle with joy after reading that. This might be the merciful and triumphant return of Lord Gandalf the System, his lord and savior. He might just be a text box, but he would surely have the most luxurious beard and eyebrows in the world. In lieu of a better name for this praiseworthy voice of blessing, Gandalf will stay Gandalf for the time being, and Anthony will praise that name, for he has been bestowed the most precious gift, the ability to access crucial information with a single thought. Loving this recap? Give us a thumbs up and subscribe to join the community. Your support is what motivates us to make more. Looking at his skill spread, he knew that making the right choice was vital. Should he take the acid shot? Maybe improving his digging abilities would give him a better advantage. Gandalf was great, but it was ultimately up to Anthony to figure out his build. As far as he knew, there were plenty of ant species on Earth capable of shooting formic acid from their abdomens. So, he had to be one of those monstrous acid-spraying ants. It opened up the option for ranged attacks, letting him do damage without getting too close to his targets. It was a strategy that could keep him from getting instantly crushed in close combat. A long-range attack would be a huge help, but given his current predicament, biting, crawling, digging, and shooting acid weren't the best tools to prioritize just yet. What Anthony desperately needed was information. He still hadn't figured out where the heck he was, or what kind of creatures inhabited this place alongside the ants and croca beasts. He was pretty positive he lacked vocal cords, meaning he only had himself to rely on for gathering intel in the tunnels. Venturing out blind into a maze of strange, unspeakable horrors would be pure madness. Just thinking about what could kill an ant on the surface was terrifying. Anthony had to actively talk himself down from a full-blown panic attack. He needed to stay rational and keep his cool if he wanted to survive. After a quick mental pep talk, Anthony locked in. From here on out, he was his own only backup. He already had his base skills figured out, now he just needed to spend his skill points. That was the million-dollar question, though. How should he go about it? The answer arrived right on cue. Gandalf himself gave him the prompt to spend his points. Anthony couldn't help but praise the wise, magnificent, disembodied system voice. He wished for Gandalf, bringer of hope and glowing beards, to remain as fluffy as ever. With so many options available, narrowing down the optimal choice was tough. He needed to tackle this logically. Being able to run faster would undoubtedly help him escape enemies when push came to shove. Tunnel sense would make navigating the underground much easier. Bite and acid were purely offensive moves, great for when he was forced into a fight. As for the bodily improvements he could purchase with biomass, he had his pick between his exoskeleton, mandibles, legs, eyes, antennae, and acid gland. It wasn't a stretch to assume that out of all the inhabitants in this area, he was currently the weakest. So, he chose to improve his eyesight using 1 point of biomass, and he dumped his single skill point into stealth, effectively boosting his ability to move unseen. The moment he confirmed his choices, his eyes started burning like absolute hell. It felt like a literal fire had ignited in his corneas. The sudden, agonizing pain felt like a betrayal from Gandalf himself. Anthony rolled around on the floor, desperate to distract himself from the burning in his eyes. But once the agony finally settled down, he had to admit the body improvement process wasn't as bad as it could have been. If he were still in his human body, healing from something like that would have taken forever. Now, he actually had some effective countermeasures for whatever this territory threw at him. With newfound confidence, he crawled his way out of the tunnel. It was time to explore. His vision felt noticeably sharper. He couldn't detect any distinct smells or vibrations in the distance, but he could see. Soon, he was presented with a choice between two pathways. The right path was where the beast had eaten the other ants, making it a massive no-go. That left him with only one option: go left, and take on whatever the path had in store for him. The panicked ant was gone. Anthony, the confident explorer, had taken the wheel. He scurried forward as fast as he could, and his speed honestly wasn't bad at all. He chuckled inwardly. His adventure was actually going off, without a hitch. Logic dictated that hanging upside down from the ceiling would maximize both his stealth and his grip skills. Now, he just needed to test his new eyes. Compared to before, he could see significantly better, even spotting mysterious branching blue veins glowing in the cavern rocks. With improved vision, he could finally inspect his own body too. Over time, a newborn ant's soft white exoskeleton was supposed to harden. Continuing his crawl, he eventually reached the end of the tunnel and was greeted by a blinding light. It was radiating from the blue veins and a massive subterranean pool. The cavern's reservoir was huge, but so were the monsters lounging around it. He had been so mesmerized by the water that he almost missed the terrifying beasts lurking at the edges. Since he was basically at the bottom of the food chain, being spotted meant instant death. Stealth wasn't just vital for survival, it was his only way to safely gather information. As for his eyesight, everyone knows having bad vision sucks. Anthony was so used to human eyes that switching to pathetic ant vision had been totally disorienting. If something wasn't actively moving, it was basically invisible to him. Ants are a communal species after all, thousands to millions of weak individuals combining to create something strong. Alone, a single ant's senses were terrible, relying on the swarm's unity to make up for it. That was exactly why his current position was so miserable. He was completely alone, expected to survive in a place where his bad eyesight could cause him to trip over a sleeping dragon. He swore to make his vision a top priority, determined not to stop until he could watch a cockroach twitch through 15 feet of solid stone. Sometime later, Anthony's exoskeleton finally hardened into a deep red. As he surveyed the cavern from the cliff above the pool, he started hearing horrific noises echoing all around him. Creeping along the walls, he knew he needed a closer look. After a few minutes of gripping the stone and racing across the ceiling, he was almost right above the source of the sound. Scanning the ground below with his upgraded eyes, he struggled to pinpoint the exact spot. The wriggling, glowing blue lines covering the stone made it hard to focus. Noticing droplets falling from the ceiling, he traced the water's source, but that didn't explain the bizarre noises. Anthony really needed to lock in. There was something he was missing. It was common sense, really, but it took him a second to connect the dots. The monsters, of course. They were the ones making the sounds. From the safety of the ceiling, he watched a growling wolf beast down below. When the canine's gaze started drifting his way, Anthony quickly scrambled behind a protruding stalactite. That was way too close for comfort. It was definitely time to take his new ability for a test drive. Anthony activated his brand new stealth skill, and his red exoskeleton immediately turned completely transparent. It was awesome. With his camouflage handled, he could finally observe the watering hole in peace. He had already gotten a good look at the nasty wolf lizard that had nearly spotted him. Next on the roster was his worst enemy, the very creature that had slaughtered his fellow ants. The homewrecker and baby snatcher itself, the malignant crocobeast. Yet looking at the horrifying lineup of monsters around the pool, Anthony realized something didn't make sense. None of these lethal predators were attacking each other. It was as if they had some unspoken truce, like a monster roundtable agreement. Anthony couldn't rule out the possibility that he'd missed some grand beast peace treaty, but he wasn't going to get any solid answers just hanging around in one spot. Creeping a little closer might help, though he had to constantly remind himself, slow and steady wins the race. Scaling down from the ceiling took a few minutes at his size. If ants could sweat, he'd be dripping enough water to fill a second pool in this cavern. But the effort paid off. Moving around while keeping stealth active had just leveled the skill up to level 2. He had covered a decent distance to get closer to the action. His initial theory about skills was spot on. With constant use, they leveled up. Hiding while observing let him kill 2 birds with 1 stone, actively gathering crucial intel while grinding his stealth. As his confidence began to balloon, he forced himself to snap out of it. Getting cocky down here was a death sentence. If he got spotted, he was dead meat. Calming his nerves, he crept close enough to see the next group of monsters near the water. A mass of beasts was tangled in a dense clump, making it hard to tell what they were at first. When he finally got a clear look, he was met with piercing red eyes, blue pincers and legs, hundreds and hundreds of legs. Seeing the grotesque anatomy of the monstrous centipedes, Anthony nearly threw up. He cursed this damn dungeon for making him look at something so vile. He could really use some stomach meds right now. As for the last resident of this cursed place, the spiked lizard monster didn't look too bad. He did need to watch out for those nasty spikes, though. Anthony might be the weakest creature here right now, but he could already see the potential to turn all these terrifying monsters into a massive harvest of biomass. All those sweet, sweet points were just waiting for him. But to pull that off, he needed thorough preparation. Over the next few hours, he diligently hung above the pool, gradually shifting his position to stay hidden from the locals. He carefully observed how the creatures moved, taking special note of where they went after leaving the water. During the first hour, the centipede beasts and the crocobeast were the first to depart. Strangely, they both headed toward the exact same exit. In hour 2, the wolf lizard beasts called it a day, making a beeline for a small tunnel at the south end. By the 3rd hour of observation, the spiky lizard was the last to leave the pool, crawling up a sheer rock wall before disappearing into a crevice. It looked like he had found another wall dweller, just like Anthony himself. He would have called the reptile brother if he wasn't actively planning to hunt it down and eat it. That intense espionage session bumped his stealth up to level 3. In this place, patience paid off. It happened at the perfect time, too, because his poor ant claws desperately needed a break. After arriving at his exit point, home sweet home was finally just 1 dig away. Anthony wished he could just relax, but he couldn't afford to slack off yet. There was still work to do. First off, he desperately needed more breathing room in his base camp, which meant more digging. Putting his strong mandibles to work, he excitedly started munching away at the dirt. Driven by instinct, he diligently cleared out the soil to secure his hideout. Just as his digging skill hit level 2, a system notification chimed in, congratulating him for securing a proper nest. Finally, after excavating like a madman, he could take a breather. Suddenly, a familiar feeling washed over him. The exact same feeling he'd get back in his old life when his family stopped sending him money and the fridge was completely empty. He was starting to get hungry, and he was no stranger to the sensation. As his stomach rumbled, he convinced himself to just hold on. When he woke up, he could go hunt his first prey. After all, he already had a spiky target in mind. The next day arrived quickly, finding Anthony perched high on the cavern ceiling. With his claws dug deep into the cold rock, a single thought consumed his mind. He was so hungry he was literally drooling over the monsters below. But with hunger came weakness and the shakes. He was slowly but surely running out of steam. His mind was flooded with visions of chocolate, bread, cake, and steak. Every delicious thing he used to eat in his past life was spinning through his head. The starvation had gotten so bad that his mind was starting to play tricks on him. The last time he spotted the crocobeast, he could have sworn it looked like a giant, juicy piece of meat, and he nearly leaped from the ceiling to take a bite. Even those nasty hundred-legged centipedes were starting to look like a delicious pile of noodles served on a golden platter. Anthony needed to solve this hunger problem fast, before he got himself killed chomping on something he shouldn't. He had been prepping his next move for way too long to let his stomach ruin his progress. 2 days. It had been 2 whole days of grueling prep work. He had studied every single aspect of this side of the cavern in excruciating detail. 2 days of zero sleep combined with debilitating starvation made it incredibly hard to stay awake. He had spent so much time hanging upside down over the basin that he'd nearly dozed off and plummeted into the water multiple times. Looking at that mysterious pool, he knew falling in would result in a very unenjoyable swim. But pushing himself to the absolute limit had a welcome side effect. Keeping his stealth mode active the entire time as a spy had raised the skill to level 4. And thanks to spending his downtime digging away to expand his hideout, his digging ability had climbed to level 3. That was what Anthony did best. He prepared, and he grew. That was how the weak hunted the strong. Still, hunger was a tough enemy to beat. He just had to hope he could successfully conquer his first meal soon. As his antennae twitched, he sensed his target closing in. He could already smell the beast's stench. When Anthony caught the glint of light reflecting off reptilian eyes inside a rock groove, he knew it was almost showtime. His chosen prey used the cavern wall as a resting place, crawling down once a day to get a drink from the pool. It was an isolated creature with a highly predictable movement pattern, a creature that could be killed. After a few tense minutes, the spiky lizard finally crawled out of its hidey hole for its daily drink. It was time to see if Anthony's prep work would pay off. Activating stealth, he crept silently along the wall, closing the distance on his reptilian prey. He silently promised his stomach that the wait was almost over. They just needed to get into the perfect strike position, and the mission would be a success. Getting a closer look at the lizard's spikes, he knew getting stung by one would be agonizing, but he couldn't afford to hesitate out of fear now. Fear is the mind killer, and his stomach was counting on him. He had prepared too much to let distractions get in the way. The timing of his pounce would dictate everything. The moment his planned opening presented itself, Anthony didn't waste a single second. Staying cloaked in stealth, he spewed an acid shot from above, splashing the corrosive liquid directly onto one of the lizard's legs. Anthony celebrated inwardly. Phase 1 was a total success. Dropping his stealth, he watched the lizard squeal in agony as its leg melted down to the flesh and bone. When the prey finally spotted the attacker responsible for its misery, Phase 2 kicked in. He silently taunted the lizard, daring it to fight him on the wall, an action that was basically courting death for the heavy beast. After all his espionage, Anthony's incredible grip skill was already at level 3. Neither the sheer rock face nor the lizard would be a challenge for him up here. Plus, he had the natural advantage of being light and nimble, whereas the beast was heavy and sluggish. With its feet burning from the acid, maneuvering on a vertical surface would be impossible for the lizard. But the simple-minded monster was blinded by pure rage. It whipped its powerful tail, trying to smash Anthony into paste. Injecting massive force into the strike, the lizard wrecked a chunk of the cavern wall, but Anthony easily leaped out of his advantageous position to safety. Everything was going exactly according to plan. He was practically playing with his food at this point. Mid-air, he aimed his next acid shot squarely at the lizard's face. Another melted wound. Another round of the beast writhing in agony. Quickly scrambling across the cavern walls, Anthony adjusted to a safer, more tactical spot. The suffering lizard's roars of pain echoed across the underground pool. That was Anthony's cue to wrap this up fast. He couldn't let the noise attract other monsters and ruin the fight he had perfectly orchestrated. Succumbing to its severe corrosive injuries, the lizard was finally starting to slow down. It was almost time to send it packing. But just before the last of its strength faded, the lizard launched one desperate final tail strike. This one caught Anthony completely off guard. The sudden lunging tail slap was way beyond his expectations. Thankfully, he was just far enough away to buy a split second to react, panic dodging out of the way. With the lizard's final burst of strength wasted on a missed attack, Anthony's chance to end things once and for all had arrived. Dropping from the ceiling, he plummeted downward, mandibles wide open and ready to latch on. A loud, sickening crunch echoed near the pool. Anthony didn't dare let go of the prey's rough skin. It was time for the final phase. The strategy was simple, a pure battle of grit. He maintained crushing biting pressure on the beast until gravity took over, sending them both into a free fall from the wall. Positioning the lizard beneath him, he let the beast tank the heavy fall damage while he continued his relentless bite. When the lizard finally stopped thrashing and resisting, he offered a silent apology. This was just the rule of the world, and food was food. Anthony began spitting point-blank acid shots all over the lizard's body to bypass its incredibly tough hide. During the onslaught, his acid shot skill leveled up to 2, a pleasantly quick level up. Inspecting his prey, he realized the poor thing wasn't actually dead yet. It looked like they were going to have to do this the hard way, for both predator and prey. Anthony mercilessly munched into the dying lizard's tough body. Blood and guts stained the cavern floor as gruesome crunches filled the silent air. After some time, his bite climbed up to level 3. It took him 10 whole minutes to do it, but the horrific job was finally done. After being reinvigorated by the sustenance, Anthony felt like a daredevil fresh off the hunt. He was like a knight walking away from a death-defying battle, a real I came, I saw, I conquered type of moment. He had literally gobbled up his enemy after the victory. Now that he thought about it, he realized he had never worked this hard for anything. In his past life, he had never really pushed himself. Looking back, he mostly remembered just feeling numb all the time. But now, he had actually defeated a level 2 Spinetta Lacertos, absorbing the XP drop and reaching level 2 himself. He even scored an additional skill point. Gandalf was suddenly super talkative with all the system notifications. So, this lizard was a Spinetta Lacertos, a name that sounded vaguely Latin. This wasn't his first encounter with Latin terminology here either. His own species assignment labeled him as Formica. Recalling his old ant-keeping hobby, he knew Formica was the Latin name for wood ants. If every creature in this world went by a Latin classification, his nerdy book smarts were undoubtedly going to come in handy. Aside from that revelation, he had learned 3 crucial things about his situation. First, he could gain experience and level up by defeating other creatures. Second, he earned a precious new skill point to allocate with every level up. And third, since this Spinetta was a level 2 monster, he could make a couple of educated guesses. The lizard was either born at level 2, or it had managed to level up at least once. More importantly, he couldn't forget what he came here to do, claim the body of his prey to strengthen his own. As a hunter, a predator, he had to eat to get stronger. He needed to consume the flesh of both the strong and the weak. Anthony was genuinely grateful for the food. Don't get him wrong, the lizard meat was far from appetizing. It was so wretched it nearly induced another vomiting session. But consuming meat from a new biomass source had awarded him a biomass point. Gandalf just kept yapping at him today. Sprawled out in his cavern, his stomach grumbles were finally replaced by loud, satisfied burps. He should be set for food for the next week at the very least. Along with the satisfaction of a full belly, he had that bonus harvest of points from Gandalf. For now, it was time to retreat to his nest and formulate his next move. Upon reaching the top of the cavern, Anthony peered down at the beasts below. They were completely obsessed with the pool's water, oblivious to the fact that one of their neighbors had just gone missing. After several minutes of scurrying, Anthony finally arrived back at his humble nest. He rubbed his front legs together like an evil mastermind. It was time to scheme. But first, he needed to check his updated status post-hunt. His core stats were pretty much the same, but his skills had grown tremendously. He couldn't help but feel like a lone adventurer on a thrilling quest, experiencing incredible growth. Even against the cruel crash of destiny and all these wild, unforeseen circumstances, he was going to prevail. Against all odds, no matter how heavily the deck was stacked against him, he would survive. But that was enough daydreaming for one day. He needed to pull his head out of the clouds and be realistic. Shaking his head, Anthony locked back in on the present. Right now, he had to make another pivotal decision, and he needed to be prudent about it. He only had 2 biomass points to spend, so he had to weigh his options carefully. His focus kept drifting back to the same place, his eye mutation. For the love of all that is holy, he wanted to evolve his eyes to +2. When Gandalf's voice prompted him, asking if he wanted to spend 2 biomass points to reach the next level, Anthony didn't hesitate to confirm. Still, he really couldn't get used to the agonizing sensation of having his eyes seemingly burned out for the sake of an upgrade. He hated the burn so much. His eyes watered endlessly from the pain, but eventually, the torment faded. His current vision was still far worse than an average human's, but it would have to do for now. Next up, spending his single skill point. Luckily, this decision was a no-brainer. He had been eyeing a specific skill for a while now, tunnel sense. He had been stuck in this cursed place for a few days, yet he was still clueless about almost everything. With so many unknowns in this dungeon, tunnel sense could be vital for his long-term survival. Using this new ability, he could essentially broaden his range of operations. It would let him explore way past his comfort zone, while guaranteeing he could navigate back to his only safe haven, his nest. When Gandalf asked for confirmation, Anthony happily obliged with a metaphorical smile on his little ant face. Obtaining a new skill felt wildly different from the sheer agony of body modification. It felt more like warm water running through his hair in the shower, except the soothing flow was happening deep inside his brain. A moment later, Gandalf chimed in to confirm that tunnel sense had been learned. Anthony just hoped it would prove its worth on his next scouting run. Gathering a few stray leaves from the cavern, he fashioned them into a makeshift bed. Before his next grand exploration, he rightfully deserved a nice comfy nap. Meanwhile, far away from his slumber, the crunch of human footsteps echoed through a dense forest. Two humanoid figures traversed the dark woods, guided by a single light source. The woman paused, asking the man if he had seen something in the shadows. He assured her it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him lately. Besides, wherever they were heading, any monster foolish enough to threaten them would be in for a very rude awakening. With his belly finally full, Anthony slept like he was floating on cloud 9. It was pure bliss. He was so comfortable he wished he could stay in that nest forever. But his paradise was abruptly cut short when he jolted awake, rolling right out of his leafy bed and planting face first into the hard dirt. In hindsight, he probably should have seen that coming. Dreams like that were always too good to be true. Still, the rude awakening gave him the clarity to stop lingering on the unobtainable. It was time to focus on exploration and map out a plan for his next meal. Anthony the ant snickered deviously, but before diving back into the busy work, there was one more thing he wanted to test out. Bending his antennae into a makeshift heart symbol, he mentally yelled, "Unlock!" like some sort of anime magical girl. When that did absolutely nothing, he tried the phrase access profile. He considered using an open sesame movie trope, but figured it wasn't even worth the effort. He honestly thought one of those standard trigger words would work. After he consumed the lizard, Gandalf had informed him that he'd unlocked a basic profile for the Spinetta Lacertos. The problem was Anthony was struggling to find the right keyword to actually open the damn thing. It suddenly occurred to him that he might just be overthinking the entire process. Loosening his grip on the nest ceiling, he dropped to the floor, struck a dramatic superhero landing, and yelled the lizard's Latin name. Surprisingly, it worked. A holographic interface popped up, displaying the basic profile of his first prey. Gandalf really had his back in times like this. Spinetta Lacertos translated roughly to thorn lizard. It has sharp spines that contain dangerous venom. After all the trouble he had gone through to kill the beast, that tiny tidbit of info was the only thing he got. It was massively disappointing, but Anthony told himself to get a grip. It did say basic profile after all. Maybe the system worked gradually. If he hunted and consumed more of the same species, he might unlock a detailed profile packed with actual, useful information. He shoved the disappointment aside. For now, he had more pressing matters to attend to. Shifting focus to his next task, his trip back to spy on the pool's residents felt a lot lighter. He even hummed a little tune while scurrying across the ceiling. Another day, another monster to turn into prey. From his vantage point, it looked like nothing had really changed since he left to feast. He did notice one tiny difference, though. Thanks to his newly upgraded +2 eyes, the subterranean pool seemed to glow slightly brighter than before. What he was most curious about, however, was the water itself. On his very first day in this cavern, he had nearly become a snack for the croca beast while near it. Yet, all that frantic running hadn't made him thirsty. On day 3, when he gathered the leaves for his bed, he hadn't felt thirsty either. Now it was day 6, he had just gorged himself on lizard meat, and he still didn't crave a single drop of water. While all these other terrifying monsters went out of their way to drink from the glowing pool daily, Anthony, an ant monster himself, hadn't felt the urge to drink at all. He was supposed to be a monster too, right? So what compelled the rest of the cavern's residents to drink that water when he had zero urge to do so? Was there something fundamentally different about them, or himself? With those questions in mind, Anthony already knew what he had to do next. He scurried down from the ceiling, determined to finally investigate the mysterious pool water and live to tell the tale. Going down there could be incredibly dangerous, so it was wise to take baby steps. Even in the face of that writhing mass of centipedes, he had to remind himself not to move too far or too fast. Observing the surrounding beasts, there was undeniably a large proportion of lizard-like creatures in this damp place. There was the bipedal croca beast and the spiked lizard. Almost every monster here had some sort of reptilian feature in its anatomy. Maybe it was a pattern. While lost in thought, he failed to notice a wolf lizard curiously and furiously heading his way. Just as the canine beast was about to pounce, it suddenly started retreating nervously, confusing our ant boy. Looking behind him, it seemed the wolf lizard was wary of the towering centipede. Anthony had been lucky enough to avoid the canine's attention, but the centipede beast was another story. Its whole tribe slithered and hissed like disgusting, overgrown, mutated insects, their crimson gazes locked onto the lone ant. Judging by their reluctance to attack, Anthony thanked the gods that his hypothesis was right. You might wonder why a survival-minded ant would risk coming out into the open near the pool right now. Well, there was only one reason he'd expose himself to monsters that could kill him in a split second. During his days of observing the locals, he had never once seen a creature get attacked while approaching, drinking from, or leaving the pool. Not even once. It was like some sort of universal neutral zone. There had been plenty of conflicts during his scouting days, sure, but the monsters always took their disputes outside the pool's perimeter. In conclusion, there had to be something special about this water source that compelled the monsters to hold back, and Anthony was positive it had nothing to do with simple hydration. He knew he couldn't ignore it out of sheer curiosity, but he really didn't want to drink the pool water. Steeling his resolve, Anthony closed his eyes and dunked his face into the basin to take a sip of the mysterious liquid. His immediate reaction was to jump back and roll across the ground because the water burned his tongue like absolute hell. The tiny portion he managed to swallow lit a fire in his guts. For some ungodly reason, it felt like drinking hydrochloric acid. Was this really what the myriad of creatures came here for? Did they seriously show up every day just to drink this painful, burning water of death? If so, what the hell was wrong with them? Had Anthony been reborn into a cavern full of masochistic monsters? He still couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. Aside from the burning sensation, there was virtually no change to his health or status. Given its blockbuster appeal among the locals, he expected something spectacular to happen. But for him, it had absolutely no effect. Nothing at all. Since he had accomplished what he came to do, he decided it was time to explore the rest of the cavern. But before leaving, he just couldn't resist going back for one more sip. This time, he slurped as hard as he could, taking in as much liquid as his tiny body could handle. Just like before, it freaking burned. He ended up rolling all over the floor again, spitting out what he'd just ingested in sheer agony. Throwing up the majority of the pool water, he concluded that the stuff was simply horrible. He made a mental note to never, ever try it again, no matter what. Now that he had investigated the mystery of the pool, it was time to expand his exploration and map out the cave network using his new tunnel sense. With his newly acquired ability, navigating became simple. All he had to do was head toward the regions where the glowing light veins were the densest. Unexpectedly, he also started picking up a distinct scent from a distance, making him wonder what other sorts of creatures lurked within these strange tunnels. While racking his brain and constantly staying on the move, he accidentally stumbled upon something incredibly familiar. A man-made structure designed to bridge a large vertical distance between lower and higher levels by dividing it into smaller, manageable steps. Stairs. They were unmistakably stairs. Looking down the length of the staircase, Anthony noticed the winding blue lines were present here as well. Fueled by curiosity and excitement, he hurriedly made his descent to take a closer look. It appeared as if these stairs had been carved directly into the solid rock. There was even intricate ornamentation on every single step. Now, who exactly would be responsible for carving solid rock? That was the question he enthusiastically asked himself. Humans, obviously. This was the first tangible evidence he had found proving that some sort of humanoid civilization existed in this new world. He couldn't help but wonder what sort of fantasy people lived here. Anthony daydreamed of saving mighty dwarves from a power that threatened their very existence. Or maybe he'd encounter legendary mystical elves known for their longevity and beauty. No matter what he ended up meeting, he had to admit things were getting vastly more interesting. He was halfway down the stairs when he stopped to ask himself why humans would bother carving stairs into this particular tunnel and not the others. Well, for a self-proclaimed genius like himself, the answer was obvious. This path had to be a frequently used travel route. Therefore, they had put in the effort to make it convenient to travel up and down. This meant there was a high likelihood of finding more stairs in the immediate area. Perhaps there was even a direct path to the surface where he could finally escape this miserable, danger-filled cavern. That possibility gave Anthony the courage to take the next step. Here goes nothing. As he traversed the downward spiral, he realized these stairs were even more useful than he had initially thought. He couldn't believe he hadn't realized it sooner. He could actually use the steps to measure himself. Assuming the people in this world were roughly the same size as the humans in his old one, he could compare his own body to the stairs. By crunching the numbers using the height and length of each step relative to his physique, Anthony concluded he might be a little smaller than he originally thought. He estimated he was about a meter long. But wait. That meant all those terrifyingly massive monsters around the pool were actually fairly small from a human's perspective. Sure, in Anthony's eyes, they looked like towering giants that could stomp him out with ease. But to an adult human, they were probably just the size of normal, everyday animals. This led Anthony to question the difficulty of the monsters in this area. Could they actually be super weak, easy mode tutorial monsters? That line of thought opened up a much more terrifying possibility. If the monsters in this place were considered weak, he didn't even want to know what kind of stronger horrors lurked deeper within the dungeon. On that note, he decided not to march straight to his death today. It was farewell to the dangerous staircase for now. But upon hopping off onto a different floor, Anthony noticed even more signs of human activity. There were actual torches mounted on the walls. The further he traveled, the more signs of civilization presented themselves. Perhaps the surface was closer than he thought. As he ventured deeper into the tunnel, the pulsating veins of light along the walls grew fewer and farther between. Although the dimming light was a perfect setup for a stealthy creature like him, he just couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His heart was literally pounding in his chest, trying to break free in a wild mix of emotions. There was a very real possibility of meeting a real person from another world. Wasn't that exciting? He already had a million questions lined up in his mind. What did they look like? What fantastical race would they be? Did they know magic? Maybe there was an adventurers guild that explored dungeons. Maybe he'd be able to communicate with them through sign language or some form of interpretive dance. Anthony's mind was racing all over the place, already envisioning a grand breakthrough in human-ant relations on a massive scale. He was fairly certain humans didn't often encounter one of their own trapped inside a monster's body. It was entirely possible he was the first of his kind. As he ventured further, the cavern started becoming narrower and the slopes much steeper. It didn't take long for a blinding light to wash over his blurry ant vision. Looking up, he saw a massive hole in the cavern ceiling. And if he wasn't mistaken, that was actual sunlight pouring in from above. It was the first time he had seen and felt the sun since arriving here. He silently apologized to the holy light for taking such a luxury for granted in his previous life. The discovery of sunlight meant the surface, the outside world, was a lot closer than he had originally thought. Looking in the other direction, he spotted more light sources ahead, pointing to even more human construction. Before he could even finish the thought, Anthony happened upon a partially open wooden door. Judging by the structure's design, it looked like a guardhouse right in the middle of a dungeon. But the most curious thing was the red light emanating from the room's window. This light was different. It was moving, accompanied by the sound of scrambling footsteps. Who would have thought? Humans. Real humans, clad in light armor and holding some kind of glowing device. Anthony just stood there, amazed. He guessed the device was meant to detect the presence of monsters. Given how pitch black these caverns were, it had to be incredibly hard for them to traverse the tunnels and find whatever they were looking for. While the woman held the detector, the man's hands began to glow with a magical light. It felt unreal to watch it happen in real time, but Anthony knew exactly what it was: magic. Real, actual magic. He praised Gandalf for bringing him to a fantasy world. He was already wondering if these people would teach him a few spells. But while our boy was practically foaming at the mouth over the possibilities, the man aimed his glowing hands squarely in Anthony's direction. Wait, wasn't that red crystal supposed to detect monsters? That meant it was tracking him. He had been so caught up in the moment that he'd completely forgotten he was a monster too. Now Anthony was staring down the barrel of a locked-on magical spell. He was dead meat. It wasn't supposed to go down this way, right? It was just a misunderstanding. But the only prudent decision left was to scurry away, like the bug he was. Run, Anthony, run. He wanted to beg the humans for mercy, but he completely lacked the ability to speak. To make matters worse, he tripped over a loose rock while scrambling for his life. He just wanted to tell them he was a tiny, harmless ant. But the mana-fueled fireball was already closing in. The blast didn't hit him directly, but the shockwave sent him tumbling. His legs ached from tripping and sprinting. His mind screamed at him to move, but his body stubbornly refused. Trapped and momentarily immobile, he watched helplessly as even more fireballs launched toward him. He had to muster every remaining fiber of willpower in his muscles just to force himself back into a sprint. He tried using the stone columns for cover, but it was useless. From another angle, a whistling arrow nearly pierced his abdomen. If he wanted to make it out of this pinch alive, he desperately needed a distraction. But first, he had to secure an escape route. He scrambled through the random tunnels, relying on his tunnel sense to quickly judge whether a path was safe or a dead end. After bypassing 3 pathways, Anthony found one radiating a god-awful stench. The humans were hot on his heels, so he decided to fight back like the monster he was, unleashing a dual acid shot right at them. It didn't slow them down much, it just pissed them off, prompting another arrow in retaliation. Thankfully, Anthony's reflexes were getting sharp, and he barely ducked under the whistling projectile. One thing was certain, his grand dream of human ant diplomacy had literally gone up in smoke. Multiple fireballs chased the lone ant like magical homing missiles. Anthony had been running in a panic for so long that he lost track of his surroundings, slamming hard into a protruding rock. But thanks to Gandalf's blessings, he managed to squeeze into a tiny, narrow tunnel to catch a desperate breather. Realizing what had just happened, he mentally beat himself up for being so stupid. He had failed to remind himself that he wasn't human anymore, which meant his human privileges were completely revoked. From now on, he had to factor in the reality that he was a 3-foot-long monster ant before attempting to socialize. From the darkness deeper inside his little tunnel, menacing hissing sounds echoed out. He might have messed up earlier, but he needed to snap out of it immediately. Anthony had to weigh his options, face the hissing centipede horde ahead or the human fireballs behind him. But when the fireball-slinging mage ominously poked his head into the tunnel opening, Anthony's choice was made for him. Anthony hit the gas and ran for his life as another cluster of fireballs condensed in the man's hand. Thankfully, he was fast enough to disappear into the darkness before the spell was unleashed. Relying on tunnel sense, he expertly navigated the narrow underground pathways. Sensing the centipede clump wasn't far off, he psyched himself up for an impromptu, highly dangerous plan. All he had to do was use the centipede beast as a meat shield against the humans. Fortunately, he had his stealth skill to hide his presence from the repulsive lump of danger noodles. He figured a well-placed acid shot would be a surefire way to piss the insects off, but what happened next would completely determine his fate. Outrunning the angry horde would be the ultimate race against time, and he seriously doubted his own stamina. Deactivating stealth, he knew he was out of options. It was do or die. Carefully aiming his abdomen at the writhing clump, he spewed a volley of corrosive acid shots directly into the massive beasts. It was an expertly aimed scatter shot that splashed almost every centipede equally. The acid wasn't powerful or corrosive enough to melt through their armored bodies, but that was fine. He wasn't trying to kill them anyway. He achieved exactly what he set out to do. He thoroughly pissed off a giant lump of deadly centipedes. With their endless, scuttling legs, they immediately swarmed after our poor ant boy. The race against time had officially begun. Several minutes of intense sprinting later, Anthony was practically crying over the mess he'd gotten himself into. Navigating back to the tunnel entrance was taking way too damn long. At this rate, his stamina was going to run dry before he could execute the bait and switch. He suffered a few horrifyingly close calls along the way, narrowly dodging the powerful lunging bites of the centipede snapping at his heels. But catching a glimpse of the light at the end of the tunnel, Anthony hit a second wind. Salvation was waiting. Like a deranged insect, he burst out of the tiny tunnel, right where the mage was waiting to char him to bits. But the man clearly hadn't RSVP'd for an oversized insect party, completely caught off guard as the centipede horde poured out of the hole behind Anthony like a sickening flesh train. Amidst all the sudden chaos, Anthony stuck a safe landing. All that was left to do was make his escape. Easier said than done when a horrific crawling beast was pissed off enough to chase him to the ends of the earth. Running was useless now. He simply tucked his body into a defensive curl, repeatedly chanting in his head that he didn't want to die. As if Anthony's desperate prayers had reached the ears of a god, the centipede lobsters suddenly started blowing up right before they could reach him. Who was blowing up and slicing through the giant centipedes? The humans, of course, who had just been trying to exterminate a single ant a moment ago. Anthony kept his head down, not daring to draw any attention or violence his way. Seeing his window to escape the chaos, he mentally excused himself as he carefully crawled toward the edge of the battlefield. It would have been a flawless escape if a few straggler centipedes hadn't spotted him and given chase like tenacious little demons. He was so preoccupied checking his 6 that he carelessly bumped right into a human leg. Anthony frantically slid backward just a split second before the human's twisting spear skewered the ground where he'd just been. Better yet, the spear strike meant for him ended up impaling the straggling centipede hot on his trail. Once again, Anthony thanked Gandalf the system for his bountiful luck. He had been spared repeatedly by a higher power's perfectly timed interventions. He would have loved to praise the bearded wizard more, but he was still in deep trouble. Luck alone wouldn't save him from the 2 factions tearing the room apart. Public enemy number 1, the human guards. Public enemy number 2, the centipede beasts. After putting some distance between himself and the anarchy, Anthony finally managed to activate his stealth. Panting, he planned his next move. Where could he even hide in a place like this? Catching sight of an open doorway leading God knows where, he decided it would just have to do. Slipping inside with sneaky movements and his active camouflage, he managed to secure a solid hiding spot. Peeking from behind the doorway's wall, he observed the all-out war between the humans and centipedes that he had just started. He felt a little terrible about pitting his fellow monsters against the human guards, but the situation hadn't exactly left him with a choice. It was either get sliced by a blade and blown up by magic, or let his lovely neighbors wage war against the guards. Meanwhile, in the quiet city of Lyria, diligent Commander Titus was working late into the night. The stress lines on his face deepened. Some damned fools just couldn't leave the dungeon situation to him and his legion. If it were up to the old commander, he'd be down in the dungeon 24/7 instead of cooped up in a dark office, burning the midnight oil over senseless paperwork. Lately, his job consisted of repeating himself a million times to idiots who didn't know their left from their right, rather than actually getting to swing his beloved weapon. Out of pure frustration, he nearly snapped his desk in half. That was his wake-up call to calm down and step out for some fresh manor air. Stepping out of the dimly lit office, the forward garrison troops immediately snapped to attention. Titus didn't even acknowledge them, striding straight down the halls. He pushed through another heavy door, where yet another batch of clean-cut troops stood at attention for their valiant leader. Everywhere he went, everything stopped. In this place, he was practically a god. He pushed forward until he reached a simple wooden door flanked by 2 armed guards. Titus demanded a rundown of the situation from Tribune Aurelia, who diligently complied. 15 minutes ago, a monster had approached their guard station, but instead of attacking, it fled. The guard team signaled the on-duty centurion before pushing deeper into the cavern. From the guards' perspective, they were dealing with a grotesque ant monster, something that deserved to be purged with the hottest fire and the sharpest blade. But Titus found the report strange. He double-checked the monster hadn't attacked head-on but actually ran away. He promptly turned toward the unassuming wooden door. Alarmed, Tribune Aurelia asked where he was going. The commander casually replied that he was personally joining the suppression expedition. Titus's interest was piqued. A monster with enough intelligence to flee danger was unheard of. Beyond that wooden door, the guards were still locked in an intense war against the centipedes. Mages were unleashing their best spells to incinerate the beasts. No matter how ferocious the centipedes were, they were no match for the sheer power of mana. Meanwhile, Anthony was just trying to find a better vantage point, only to get trapped right in the middle of the pandemonium with nothing but his stealth ability to keep him alive. Anyone with eyes could see this wasn't a battle anymore. It was a straight-up slaughter. Anthony was completely powerless. He was far too weak to add anything of value to this fight. It wasn't like he could mince enemies with a long-range mandible attack. In clueless moments like this, he'd usually ask Gandalf what to do. But instead of magical advice, he imagined getting a crisp slap to the face from a familiar figure, his old human self. He mentally thanked human Anthony for the much-needed wake-up call in such desperate times. Looking on the bright side, this whole string of misadventures had finally confirmed a few major curiosities. First, it verified that magic existed in the form of human spells. Second, there was actually a human society in this world. Also, the power gap between his current ant self and the humans was massive. He learned another game-changing lesson too. Right now, the king of all attributes was HP. After getting blasted by stone shards and scorched by stray fireballs, his health had reached a critical point. He was down to 15 horsepowers, practically half. But hey, at least he finally figured out how much damage he'd actually take in combat. The cost of that lesson, however, was that he now needed a way to regenerate those missing hit points. Trying to figure out how to get his health bar back into the green, he figured his HP might recover automatically over time. Then again, it might be more complicated than that. He might actually have to find a way to heal his wounds manually. Either way, he couldn't waste the golden. Opportunity, this war had dropped right in front of him. An endless sea of beast corpses littered the ground like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Some were even pre-cooked by the flames. It was time to lock in. There was a mountain of biomass just waiting to be devoured. Giving in to his primal instincts, Anthony began ingesting the creatures that were much stronger than him, packing on biomass by the second. It took him quite a while to waddle from one end of the buffet to the other, but the harvest was nothing short of bountiful. By the time he finished, he was so stuffed he could barely breathe, let alone move. The whole time, he tried to picture a feast fit for a king, just as Gandalf would have intended. In his mind's eye, the centipedes were perfectly cooked and garnished to look as appetizing as possible, but reality always hit the second the meat touched his tongue. There were no two ways about it, these centipede beasts tasted absolutely horrendous. Just thinking about how much of that disgusting meat he'd choked down made Anthony want to throw up. Still, putting the taste aside, the biomass he gained was what really mattered. His feast for a king had unlocked the basic profile of his prey, the Ungui Skulendra. He opened the damn notification at once, only to find it just as useless as ever. It merely stated that the claw centipede had strong claws and a venomous tail spike. Big surprise. Before spending his hard-earned biomass, he wanted to check his stats. Everything was progressing smoothly on the skills and stats front. Even better, his HP had started to recover slightly over time. Now, he had 2 biomass points to spend however he pleased. According to the Holy Book of the Path, the system shall uplift all beings, but only if mortal kind is united will they be able to reach their final destination. Plopping down in the comfort of his makeshift home, Anthony finally relaxed after a chaotic day. All he could do was pray to glorious Gandalf for a more peaceful time today. He had 2 major tasks on his agenda. The first was mutating his eyes to +3, but he desperately needed 1 more biomass point for that upgrade. To ensure he didn't slip up, he figured that relocating his nest had to come next. After catching some much-needed rest, Anthony got right back to work. But the moment he stepped out of his cozy nest, he saw that the war between the humans and centipedes was still raging on. So much for his perfect day. Still, the work wasn't going to finish itself. Staying carefully hidden, Anthony crawled away from the fiery battlefield, expertly navigating the caverns in stealth mode. He couldn't help but wonder what these soldiers were even doing in this cursed place. They seemed hell-bent on eradicating every single monster they came across. When he finally reached the mystical water pool, Anthony realized the human soldiers had completely taken over the area. He was instantly enamored by the fancy technology and funky crystals dangling just above the water's surface. But he quickly shook his head to get his focus back. This was no time to marvel at magic, especially not at the cost of his own safety. As the days dragged on, his dream of getting out of this place alive seemed to slip further and further away. It would be entirely too arrogant to think he could sneak past a whole battalion in his current state. Simply burrowing into his nest also carried the heavy risk of getting raided. Realistically, he only had one viable option left, but without enough upgrades, that choice was basically a one-way ticket to an early grave. He probably wouldn't even get an ant-sized coffin. For now, the only path forward was a terrifying one, heading back to his spawn point, the lair of the Croca beast. Taking one last look around, he gave an emotional farewell to the little nest that had kept him safe this whole time. He'd had some great times inside that hole. If he'd just had a few fellow ant bros to chill with, it could have been a real home. Speaking of ant bros, maybe this was the perfect time to track down his birth nest. If he could reunite with the colony and hang out with his own kind, this new life might not be so bad after all. Besides, the beast that had snatched him before he hatched couldn't have dragged him too far from his original home. If he remembered the details correctly, the colony had to be down one of the 3 burrows near his spawn point. Choosing to stay positive despite the uncertainty, Anthony set off. His ultimate goal was to find the queen and his long-lost ant bros. Maybe he'd even give his mom a hug when they finally reunited. Moving away from the pool and following the dim light, Anthony scurried forward at full speed. He noticed that the weird veins lining the cavern walls were glowing much brighter than before. Not only that, but they were pulsating faster too. It was a bizarre sight. Reaching the end of the veiny tunnel, he slowed his pace and carefully scouted ahead, praying there were no threats waiting to pounce. After eyeballing the open space in front of him, he breathed a heavy sigh of relief. He was in the clear, for now at least. To figure out the best path forward, Anthony activated tunnel sense. Mapping out this mysterious subterranean world would finally take him away from the cursed surface and its nasty human armies. But just a few minutes into his scouting, His antennae suddenly picked up on something. Curious about the title? Leave a comment asking for the name, and I'll make sure to reply and pin it for everyone. About 100 meters away from his current position, there was a distinct shift in the air. Zeroing in on the change, Anthony hyper-focused his antennae in its direction. He was so dead set on following the trail that he actually bumped his head against a wall. The signal continued forward, but the tunnel split into two potential paths. It felt like Gandalf was forcing him to make the call. After a preliminary scan and going purely off his gut, both options seemed pretty terrible. Left with no other choice, he dumped his accumulated biomass into upgrading his antennae for better accuracy. Just like upgrading his eyesight, this level up hit him with a searing pain that left him rolling on the ground. He cursed cruel Gandalf for making him suffer just for a slight bump in his survival odds. Still, with his newly refined senses, he confirmed that one of the paths carried a faint but promising scent. It felt a little less like instant death, making the choice an easy one. Taking a deep breath, Anthony pulled the trigger and pushed forward. His mantra for the day, slow and steady wins the race. Halfway down the route, his antennae sprang up, and elation filled his tiny body. He just caught a whiff of pheromones. By using their pheromone glands, ants lay trails for others to detect and follow. This had to be it. After surviving on his own for what felt like an eternity, his ant bros were finally calling him home. Of course, if he could see what was actually waiting at the end of that trail, he wouldn't be celebrating. Silk webs littered the area, set by a creature patiently waiting for its next unwitting victim. Blind to the danger, Anthony moved like the wind, following what he thought were his kin's pheromones. He was absolutely hyped, convinced the colony had lit a beacon to bring their lost boy home. But halfway through the trek, he checked himself. He couldn't afford to get carried away. He still remembered the cost of being overzealous, and his HP wasn't maxed out yet. For now, he just had to carefully navigate the unknown path until he could pick up a safer trail. As he pressed on, he noticed the tunnel itself was becoming more and more irregular. It zigzagged in a bunch of random directions. As the route grew more chaotic, the vibrations in the air grew stronger. His gut told him something was about to go down. Eventually, he hit a bottleneck where the tunnel fractured into a messy network of branching paths. Just trying to keep track of which ones looked safe was making him dizzy. Thankfully, his day of running around the caves was finally bearing fruit. His tunnel sense had reached level 2, significantly boosting his underground navigation. This skill was his most reliable tool for surviving these winding, mysterious caves. To supplement it, Anthony decided to carve out a simple set of symbols to mark the routes he'd already taken. Hopefully, it would keep him from walking in circles. The first choice is always the toughest, but he snap-picked the right-hand path. Unfortunately, it wasn't as lucky a guess as he'd hoped. The tunnel was short, and he reached the clearing at the other end relatively quickly, only to find a pack of lizard-tailed rats gnawing on the bones of their latest prey. Anthony turned his ant butt around on a dime and sprinted straight back to the previous room. Catching his breath, he tried to figure out his next move now that Plan A had failed. Walking back to the entrance of that rightmost route, he debated what symbol best communicated instant death. Keeping it simple, he scuttled up to the ceiling and carved a massive X. Hopefully, process of elimination would eventually lead him somewhere manageable. Heading down the next tunnel, he actually felt safe, pleasant even, which in a place like this was exactly the kind of feeling that could get a guy killed. Thankfully, his instincts kept him from getting complacent. As he scaled the cavern walls, he caught a glimpse of a neatly laid, expertly hidden spiderweb. Without his level 2 eyesight, he absolutely would have tripped right into it. Walking headfirst into enemy territory would have been game over. Frankly, Anthony was pissed. Those stupid spiders probably thought they were the kings of the insect world just because they could set up elaborate traps to feed on others. The way he saw it, those freaks were just lazy bums who let their webs do all the heavy lifting instead of getting off their asses. To him, the honest, hard-working ant was the pinnacle of honor. If he just had about 200 of his ant bros to command right now, he'd never cower before a spider. Words couldn't express how much he hated those web-slinging freaks. Deciding to press on and scout the area, Anthony slowed his pace to a crawl. He saw webs practically everywhere, but the architect was nowhere to be found. That didn't mean it wasn't nearby, though. Gathering intel took precedence. It was the only way to figure out the optimal path forward. Once he cleared the tricky, sticky zone, he dropped back down to the floor where the traps were thinner. Using his mandibles, Anthony snapped a loose pebble off the ground. With a little wind-up, he launched the rock straight into the mass of spiderwebs, ruining the elaborate trap with a satisfying thwack. Seeing how effective it was, he kept at it. Anthony picked up another pebble and worked on his pitch. He was basically the Shohei Ohtani of chucking rocks into spider webs. Once he'd cleared enough webs to open a relatively safe path, he dashed forward. He knew the architect of this death trap had to be hiding close by, and by destroying the structural integrity of its home with sticky pebbles, he was bound to force the monster out. Right on cue, the arachnid freak showed its ugly mug. It probably thought lunch had just arrived. It only took one glance for Anthony to almost hurl. The thing was hideous. It had 8 hairy legs struggling to support a massive bloated body. Compared to an ant's perfect 3-segment body and 6 highly functional limbs, spiders were just abominations. As far as Anthony knew, spiders were supposed to be lower on the food chain and roughly his size. The one in front of him didn't look like a high-level monster. If the many-legged fiend would just sit still for a second, he could accurately gauge the distance for a ranged attack. Wiggling his abdomen to perfect his aim, Anthony held his fire until the very last second to ensure maximum precision. Once he accounted for the wind and the angle, he let his acid fly. The nasty green goo splattered across the hairy beast, and the effects were instantaneous. Its flesh and hair let out a gnarly hissing sound as they actively burned and melted. Unfortunately, despite his upgrades, his eyesight still couldn't match a regular spider's. Luckily, he had his stealth to make up for his physical shortcomings, because he had completely fumbled that first shot. The acid's effect was brutal, but it had only grazed one of the spider's many legs. After the initial assault, Anthony quietly tailed the clueless arachnid. It clearly thought it was safe in the shadows, but Anthony's stalking skills were top-notch. Once he secured a better angle from stealth, he fired a second acid shot with absolute confidence. This time, the payload hit its target dead on. The hissing grew deafening as the spider began melting alive. Adding insult to literal injury, Anthony dropped his stealth and deliberately taunted the monster into chasing him. It was the only way to drag the coward away from its home court advantage. Despite all his mental trash talk, Anthony had to admit he was shivering inside his carapace at the thought of the spider's inevitable rampage. At least he managed to reach his safe zone before it could catch up. If push came to shove, he could always circle back to where that pack of lizard-tailed wolves was hanging out, letting the spider and the dogs duke it out while he grabbed some popcorn on the sidelines. In a perfect world, those dumb mutts would instantly aggro onto the many-legged freak the second he hid. If Anthony could just slip through their den and into safety, it would be the perfect crime. Fortunately, he didn't have to rely on a plan with that many wildcards. The pissed-off, injured spider appeared to be just as cautious as he was. It made sense. Why would the bastard move an inch when all it had to do was sit in its web and wait for some stupid prey to deliver itself on a silver platter? After a decent meal, the spider would undoubtedly heal right back to full HP. Anthony briefly pictured himself as a spider. He could practically set up a domain expansion where food just stumbled in, got trapped, and gave him free biomass. He cursed them for playing this ruthless dungeon on easy mode. His rage was hitting a boiling point. To ease his fury, Anthony decided this spider needed to die sooner rather than later. A day had passed since their first encounter. Despite being pissed off, Anthony still meticulously weighed his odds of winning. After some deliberation, he concluded the odds were actually in his favor. First, the tunnel was unusually bright. Even with his eyesight at only +2, the lighting made it serviceable enough that spotting the enemy wouldn't be too difficult. Second, based on his raw estimated stats, he and the spider seemed evenly matched, provided he could strip away its web advantage. If things went his way, he could score some fresh biomass and finally quell the lingering anger in his chest. The only question was, how exactly was he going to lure that freak out of its web? Phase 1 was already in the bag. Thanks to his 2 acid attacks from yesterday, he'd likely chunked the freak for about 5 horsepowers. The safest way to handle this hunt was to keep harassing the arachnid, ambushing it multiple times until he finally won out. After all, a single strike from those venomous fangs could land him in seriously hot water. With his antennae perked forward, eyes peeled, and his mind locked solely on the hunt, Anthony set forth. He couldn't afford a single mistake. It didn't take long to reach the web-riddled path. He inspected every inch of the route, initially finding no sign of the architect. Luckily, he stumbled upon a hidden cluster of spider eggs nearby. It felt a little cruel, but they were the perfect bait to lure that bug out of hiding. Just like he'd done with the pebbles yesterday, he started tossing the eggs onto the web, hoping to convince the spider that some juicy prey had gotten snared. Anthony kept tossing, determined not to stop until his mortal enemy showed its face. After lobbing the final egg into the silk, all that was left to do was sit, wait, and observe. He ducked behind a nearby rock with a clear line of sight to the eggs. A few hours dragged by without a single sign of the coward. It might have gotten too chicken shit after their last encounter. Just to be sure, he grabbed a pebble and chucked it right into the clump of stuck eggs. When his old trick didn't pan out, he pivoted to phase 2 of his plan, a step that required finesse rather than brute strength. He gathered small, loose pebbles from the ground, the kind that wouldn't shake or break the threads like heavier rocks would. Instead of tossing them, he gently placed the tiny stones along the web, barely causing a ripple. He planned to use this technique to silently bypass the wall of silk. With enough coverage, he could infiltrate the inner sanctum without tripping any alarms. Once he'd forged a large enough gap using his stealthy method, Anthony cautiously crept into enemy territory. He had never ventured this deep into the unknown before. Utmost caution was required, as hidden threads could be lurking anywhere. A single lapse in concentration could leave him helplessly stuck, a mistake that would easily prove fatal. Just minutes into his supposedly silent infiltration, his senses flared, warning him of a threat approaching from behind. The spider must have been spying on him the entire time. The dumbass had been patient enough to let him enter its home court, but stupid enough to sneak up right behind his rear. Anthony opened the orifice on his abdomen and let another acid shot loose. It was a critical hit. There was only one thing left to do to seal the deal. Letting out a mocking laugh, Anthony sprinted out of the web-ridden territory, hurling scathing insults over his shoulder. He was really feeling himself. He felt like the wind sweeping across the fjords, a gazelle leaping over the plains. But Anthony got way too cocky and promptly snagged himself on a loose thread of web in midair. He tripped and face-planted into the dirt, cursing himself for acting like an idiot. Now he was going to die before ever meeting his colony or even a single fellow ant. Anthony started bawling his eyes out. He was way too young to die, not even a month old yet, but after a solid minute of sobbing, nothing grim had actually happened. As it turned out, the loose thread was incredibly easy to break. When he finally turned around, he spotted the big bad spider lying ass up on the ground, its abdomen still sizzling from his acid shot. He had seriously overestimated this arachnid freak. Consuming his prey yielded a fresh source of biomass from the poor Aranea. As it turned out, the monster was just a newborn spider. Anthony was a baby killer. The title fit. He'd been worried that nibbling on such a meager amount of meat wouldn't even net him a single point of biomass, and he had to admit that his intense rage toward the poor bug had been totally misplaced. After just a few blasts of acid, it had already croaked. Unable to recover, its health pool had rapidly ticked down to 0. The experience he gained from the kill wasn't exactly hefty either. But much to his surprise, he gained 2 biomass points for eating its remains and unlocking a new species. With a much calmer demeanor, he exited the web-ridden area, clearing away the sticky obstacles in his path. Level 3 eyesight was now within realistic reach. Once his vision was out of the danger zone, he could finally focus on upgrading other aspects of his body. Maybe then he'd be able to fight something head-on without relying on cheap tricks. But he was getting ahead of himself. He couldn't afford to coast on wishful thinking. Anthony needed to suck it up and figure out how to grow into an adult ant. The most obvious route was to accrue more XP and level up. To do that, he needed to establish a safe hunting ground. As usual, he headed deeper into the winding tunnels with stealth mode engaged. Not far from the spider's nest, he stumbled across a bizarre sight, a massive crater plunging down into God knows where. It was safe to assume that the deeper you went, the more dangerous things got. If that was the case, he definitely shouldn't explore this pit right away. Better to save it for later when he was more confident in his survival skills. Worst case scenario, it was the only path forward. Using his upgraded antennae, he tried directing his tunnel sense downward to gauge the danger level. But the drop was simply too deep to scan properly. As long as he had a choice, he'd rather avoid venturing into this ominous crater. To him, this pit might as well be a dead end. But then again, so was the surface. The looming threat of certain death at the hands of humans waited above. Anthony was basically sandwiched between a rock and a deadly hard place. A truly migraine-inducing conundrum. Since he'd eventually have to explore every option anyway, he decided to double back and check out some alternative routes. Skittering around the crater's edge, he found a few branching tunnels nearby. Around here, more paths usually meant more monsters to deal with. After a few more hours of exploration, Anthony started second-guessing himself. He suspected he'd been walking in circles, and the tunnel he chose was just looping right back to where he'd started. Along the way to finding the right path, he encountered a few more new species. Whenever he entered uncharted territory, he made it a habit to check the walls for workable sections. After feeling around to ensure his chosen spot was structurally sound, his mandibles went to work digging a temporary nest to rest in. This new hidey hole would offer him at least some semblance of protection from the outside world. Even if it was a bit flimsy and hastily thrown together, it beat sleeping out in the open where threats lurked in every shadow. He didn't dig too deep this time. Instead, he hollowed out a spy nest from above, giving him a perfect vantage point of the ground below. Building this new nest unexpectedly bumped his digging skill up to level 4. Anthony was pretty pleased with himself. Even if the skill was practically useless in combat, it was nice to know he was improving somewhere. Looking back on his short time in this dungeon, he felt quite proud of his progress. He was still a weak little monster, sure, but he'd come a long way from where he started. His skills had leveled up through sheer necessity during tricky situations and close calls. He had to admit he was still pathetically weak in a fight compared to the other species down here, but he was just getting started. Now, if he wanted to explore this foreign terrain, he needed some rest to stay sharp. Back when he was human, Anthony used to raise insects. Because of that, he knew ants didn't really sleep. They just stayed perfectly still, entering a state of reduced physiological activity known as torpor to conserve energy. Even so, he enjoyed the feeling of metaphorically closing his eyes, even if he lacked actual eyelids. Maybe it was just a lingering human habit. After a full night's rest, Anthony woke up refreshed and back at peak performance. Now it was time to continue his push into the unknown. His main goal for today was securing one last biomass point to upgrade his eyesight. Once that was sorted, he could finally start experimenting with the rest of his body. Theoretically, he could focus on upgrading to a more powerful carapace, stronger legs, sharper mandibles, or a deadlier acid gland. Any of these enhancements would make hunting a lot safer and easier. After all, kills meant XP, and XP meant levels. Boosting his stats was the most practical way to progress toward becoming a fully grown adult ant. Plus, his stealth was already at level 3. He hoped to level it up even further by shadowing some new monsters in the area. Unfortunately, his first turn led him straight into a marked tunnel. It looked identical to the path extending from the cavern he had just passed through. He had accidentally circled right back to where the soldier ants were congregating. On the bright side, a rough map of the area was already forming in his mind. The layout consisted of massive main tunnels with smaller offshoots twisting away in random directions. Think of it like a city. The larger tunnels were the highways where the biggest threats roamed, while the smaller passages served as back alleys where weaker foes made their nests. Anthony had already wasted too much time on a single wrong turn. His day was definitely off to a rocky start. But armed with a better understanding of the layout, he made a more informed choice this time around, hoping to finally find what he was looking for. He'd been so hyper-focused on hunting down new sources of biomass that he hadn't even realized his tunnel sense skill had climbed to level 3. Actively trying to map the passages must have funneled a ton of XP right into the skill. It felt a little unnerving to realize the system was constantly monitoring his thoughts. As he neared his temporary nest, he spotted 2 new monster types lurking in the shadows. The first was a 3-tailed rat, with each tail ending in a deadly spike. Those rodents were just freaky. The second was a mollusk-like creature, with a long, slimy body covered in brightly colored organic spines. Anthony would bet good money that those slimy bastards were highly poisonous. They were at least twice his size and could easily scale walls. Sticking to the shadows and avoiding their nasty trails seemed like the smartest play. While deliberating on his next target, Anthony caught the sweet, faint sound he'd been hoping for. The chaotic din of growling beasts and gnashing claws echoing from a tunnel just ahead. Energized by the opportunity, he sprinted forward like a shadow fox. Ever since he was gifted this bizarre, game-like system, he'd been determined to figure out exactly how it ticked. A few burning questions lingered in his mind. How exactly did the system dish out XP when a monster died? Was it divided evenly among everyone who dealt damage, or did the player who landed the killing blow take it all? From what he'd seen so far, he had never received an XP notification in the middle of a fight. The notification only ever popped up after the prey had expired, practically confirming that XP was only awarded upon a foe's death. To get some hard answers, he needed to test a few theories. Thankfully, the perfect scenario had just presented itself. Peeking into the tunnel, he saw that the chaotic noise was an all-out turf war between a massive croc beast and an army of centipedes. Swearing by the shining beard of Gandalf, Anthony hated those stupid centipedes from the bottom of his heart. They always swarmed together, acting like they owned the place. But by the looks of it, the croc beast wasn't going down without a fight. It had already torn through a few of the nasty bugs and was doing its absolute best to track and counter each remaining opponent. The reptile had the strength and speed to rip the gnarly monsters to shreds. But the centipedes were just too slippery. Enjoying his front row seat to the carnage, Anthony was more than happy to chip into a fight he had no business being in. As soon as one of the centipedes stumbled and slowed down, the croc beast lunged. Simultaneously, Anthony readied his own attack. A split second before the reptile could tear the bug apart, Anthony sniped it with a thick shot of acid for a critical hit. The sheer agony of the melting acid completely disabled the centipede, turning it into easy prey for the croc beast's lethal jaws. Like a starving predator, the reptile clamped down in a death grip and refused to let go. However, by striking so recklessly, the croc left itself wide open to retaliation. Safe in his hiding spot on the ceiling, Anthony watched the 3 remaining centipedes fan out to capitalize on their comrade's sacrifice. The first one struck from behind, coiling tightly around the reptile's neck to choke it out. It would have been a lethal move if the bug had managed to secure its grip right away, but a violent thrash of the reptile's tail swept it aside. Realizing the tail was a major threat, the other 2 centipedes moved to neutralize it. But they were way too naive if they thought they could easily pin down the croc beast's most flexible and devastating weapon. While the many-legged freaks drew all the aggro, Anthony sneakily spat another acid shot squarely onto the reptile's back. Between the burning acid and the poison it was accumulating from the drawn-out fight, the big, bad croc was moving noticeably slower. Meanwhile, the acid-burned centipede scurried out of the croc's range to play defensively. Anthony watched the turf war with a smug, silent laugh. He felt like a puppeteer making creatures far stronger than himself dance in the palm of his hand. For his third sneaky attack, he targeted the injured centipede one last time. Normally, Anthony would never dare act so brazenly, but with the monsters entirely focused on each other, he had the perfect window to intervene from afar. He highly doubted these freaks would abandon such a juicy meal just to chase down a little ant. Even though the croc beast was fading fast from its litany of injuries and mounting poison damage, the centipedes played it safe, waiting it out before going in for the kill. Every time the reptile stepped forward, they retreated. Their victim was clearly on its last legs and would lose the strength to fight back at any moment. Even so, the proud croc beast was determined to drag at least one more insect to the grave with it. With ragged breaths, it gathered the absolute last of its strength for a final desperate lunge. It was a clumsy attempt, but it squeezed every last drop of gas out of the tank. The croc managed to close the gap. Fueled by murderous determination, it locked onto the slowest centipede in the bunch. Swiping wildly with its claws to extend its reach, the reptile actually managed to snag the critter. Unfortunately, the acid on the croc's back had severely corroded its scales and flesh, and the agonizing poison coursing through its veins was just too much. The absolute unit simply didn't have any power left behind its strikes. It collapsed heavily to the ground, the impact echoing through the cavern. Anthony could feel his heart pounding in his tiny ant thorax. This was it, the perfect scenario. All he had to do was aim carefully and steal the final kill with his last load of acid. Seeing the centipedes creep forward to claim their hard-won prize, he knew this shot had to count. A greedier ant would have aimed for the croc beast. It was obvious that taking down the mini-boss would yield the most XP. But Anthony was a realist. He targeted the slow, injured centipede instead, doubling down on the acid damage against the many-legged freak. It thrashed in agony before finally succumbing to the deadly acid. Just as Anthony expected, the remaining centipedes completely ignored their dying comrade. They were laser-focused on feasting upon the dead reptile. With one less mouth to feed, they gladly tore into the carcass, spilling blood and guts everywhere. And since Anthony didn't get a system notification for the croc beast's death, his theory was confirmed. Only the final blow mattered for XP. Thankfully, he'd scored a clean kill on the level 3 claw centipede. It awarded him a massive chunk of points, skyrocketing him straight to level 3 and netting him a shiny new skill point. The croc beast had easily dealt 80% of the damage to the bug, but Anthony got to reap the entire reward. While happily reviewing his harvest, he noticed the rest of the centipede swarm slithering out of the woodwork to mooch off the ones who had actually done the heavy lifting. Anthony's biggest win, however, was arguably hitting level 5 in his stealth skill. He couldn't help but praise the great Gandalf for bestowing such a rich bounty upon him. Truly, the wizard's wisdom, magnificent facial hair, and aggressive eyebrows were worthy of worship. Meanwhile, let's zoom out and see what was happening up in the human world on the surface. Alberton, the lore master of Leohem from AI Lyria, had once studied the monster waves triggered during the cataclysm known as the Rending. Today, lore master Alberton was en route to a high-stakes meeting at the royal castle, accompanied by Commander Titus. They casually bantered. It sounded like these two have known each other for a long time. Alberton was quite prickly today, clearly annoyed about having to attend the meeting. Taking a look at the agenda, he knew a formal call to arms before the entire court was never just a routine gathering. Commander Titus admitted that the whole thing had been arranged by Alberton's dearest aunt, a woman the lore master wasn't exactly thrilled to face. Commander Titus praised him for growing into such a brave and principled legionary. With mock respect, Alberton jokingly warned the old man to watch his tongue. Titus quickly reminded him to use his proper title. He was still a commander after all. The two chuckled, their banter revealing a long and comfortable history together. Arriving at the gate for the meeting, they bumped into a young man hurrying out. He hurriedly paid his respects to the two prominent figures before escorting them into the inner sanctum. As the heavy doors opened, the atmosphere immediately shifted. Inside a hall bathed in the glow of the setting sun, some of the land's most important figures had already gathered. At the far end of the hall sat a woman on an ornate throne. Commander Titus of the Deep Legion and lore master Alberton were announced with the utmost fanfare and respect. They marched straight toward the throne, backs rigid and expressions solemn, drawing mixed reactions from the early arrivals. One attendee in particular, an absolute baddie, turned around to shoot them a wink. Commander Titus glanced at the stoic Alberton and sighed. They paid their proper respects to the woman in charge, who offered the legionaries a warm smile and permission to be at ease. She was clearly glad to see her nephew after so long. Alberton had buried himself in his studies for far too long just to avoid the stuffiness of royal life. Commander Titus knew the Queen had called this meeting, at least in part, to drag the stubborn lore master out of his cave and force him to clean up. With everyone present, the Queen formally opened the proceedings. She had gathered representatives from many of the kingdom's most prominent cities to discuss the recent activities within the dungeon and determine their course of action moving forward. As the most qualified person to speak on the matter, Commander Titus took the floor first. He reported that mana levels within the dungeon were climbing rapidly. According to his team's projections, the kingdom could expect a wave to break in the first strata in as little as 3 or 4 days. Even more alarming, legionaries on guard had witnessed a monster ant emerging dangerously close to the surface. Given the special nature of this creature and the grim implications of its presence, tensions and anxiety were running high. The Legion was already setting a plan in motion to push deeper into the dungeon, intending to find and exterminate the monster ant colony before it was too late. To pull off an operation of this scale, Commander Titus formally requested military aid from the throne to bolster their ranks. They desperately needed help securing the city from the upcoming wave, which would free up Legion resources to fully commit to delving into the creature's nest. Titus was clear and succinct in his messaging, but his request was met with deafening silence. After a brief pause, poorly disguised laughter and disrespectful whispers filled the room, clearly mocking the old commander. Breaking the rude atmosphere, the winking baddie from earlier stepped forward to speak her mind. The Queen, however, wasn't laughing. Looking as sharp as ever, she granted Corin permission to speak. Corin stated that for over a century, the city of Lyria had prospered under the enlightened rule of Queen Verita and her forebears. Every citizen of the city had enjoyed a level of peace seldom seen, even in the millennia following the Great Cataclysm. During this peaceful era, the responsibility of managing dungeon activity had rested exclusively in the hands of the Deep Legion. Yet, even though dungeon diving had become one of Lyria's central economic cornerstones, many now viewed the Legion as an overbearing and resource-hungry force. Corin argued that, as usual, Commander Titus and his Legion were begging for more assistance to defend the city, proving their inability to meet their obligations despite already taking the lion's share of the funds. The Queen didn't appreciate Corin's blatant attack and ordered her to get straight to the point. Representing the mercenary union, Corin petitioned the throne once again to grant her organization direct authority over dungeon access. She promised to properly administer the existing resources and manage her own people far better than the Legion ever could. She also had the backing of the Associated Merchants Guild. The guild's representative, a fishman, chimed in, sharing projections that regulating dungeon exploitation could double the kingdom's profits within 2 years. Queen Verita abruptly cut them off, denying Corin's request for the umpteenth time. She didn't take kindly to Corin's casual dismissal of the threat the monster ant represented. The queen sharply suggested that everyone in the room brush up on their history. The very land their beloved city was built upon once belonged to another prosperous kingdom that had fallen. As its current ruler, she refused to repeat her predecessor's mistakes by underestimating the dungeon. She reminded the court that the dungeon wasn't just a resource or a mine to be exploited. It was a constant threat that demanded absolute caution. The Deep Legion had liberated this land all those years ago. For that reason alone, the rulers of Lyria would continue to place their trust in them. Corin pushed back, arguing that the future prosperity of the land and its people mattered more than ancient history, firmly stating that the dungeon should be respected but never feared. Ignoring her ignorant counterpoints, Queen Verita fully approved Commander Titus's proposal. She committed her royal guards to the Legion's command for the duration of the wave, making it known that Lyria would continue to trust the Deep Legion against the upcoming terror. When asked if he was confident he could handle both the wave and the ant colony, Titus assured the crown that Legion Emma Abbey, the Deep Legion, would deliver. They had been doing this job for over 3,000 years. Across all the lands of Pangangera, one fact had always remained true. Underground, absolutely no one could match the Legion's strength. While that might have been true for the last 3 millennia, they hadn't met Anthony yet. Our boy was currently busy trying to finalize his harvest by splitting his prey wide open. Getting a good look at the innards of his kill, he almost hurled at the sheer hideousness of it. Even so, he swallowed his disgust and dug into his dinner. No matter how vile the smell, look, and taste were, he simply couldn't pass up the opportunity to gain some sweet, sweet biomass. Those first few bites were incredibly tough. He could barely choke down the raw centipede meat. It was easily the worst-tasting thing he had ever put in his mouth. His brain screamed at him that starving might actually be a better option than enduring this for another second. Thankfully, the voice of his past kept him grounded. Eating a pile of smashed centipede corpses couldn't possibly be worse than dying of starvation, right? Stealing his resolve and his gut, he ignored the vile flavor and feasted like an absolute beast. He lost himself in the gruesome process until the system finally awarded him the single point of biomass he had worked so hard for. It seemed that no matter the creature's size, it only yielded 1 point of biomass. Curious about what happened to the parts that were simply impossible to digest, Anthony stuck around the scene of the kill. After waiting for a moment, the leftover hard shells, claws, and feet began to radiate a bright light. It was seriously creepy. It looked as though the remaining materials were being absorbed straight back into the soil. If that was the case, the entire cavern network had to be passively absorbing dead monster pieces all over the place. As for why it was doing that, well, that was another question he needed to answer. The more he learned, the more questions popped up. Pushing the cave's mysteries aside for now, Anthony refocused on the most pressing business at hand. He currently had 3 biomass points and 1 skill point to spend. Given how incredibly scarce these upgrades were, he was treating this like a high-stakes boardroom decision. When it came to the biomass, he already had his sights set on improving his vision to level 3. He desperately needed a software update. His policy of thoroughly assessing threats before jumping into a fight remained unchanged, making an eye upgrade an absolute must. Without hesitating, he pulled the trigger and blew all his available biomass on the enhancement. He braced himself as best he could, but nothing could really prepare him for the searing pain a vision upgrade brought. Anthony rolled frantically around the floor. The agony was far worse than before. He thought the last upgrade was bad, but this was just inhumane. If he had to describe the feeling, it was as if an entire swarm of angry bees had decided his eyeballs were the greatest offense to their species. He was brought to tears by the spectacularly intense itching. After things had calmed down a bit, the prompt to spend his available skill point popped up. Since he was already in the worst pain he had ever experienced, he mentally hit the yes button. Now that stealth had reached level 5, a new upgrade option was available for him to choose. It looked like level 5 skills could be upgraded to improved versions at the cost of another skill point. He would be an idiot not to select a skill that had served as his ultimate lifeline in multiple instances. Upgrading stealth to advanced stealth improved his passive ability to avoid notice and greatly increased its effectiveness when he remained still. Seeing his status window almost moved him to happy tears this time. He had come so far. He felt re-energized to conquer these caves and make every creature inside bow to his incredible power. Well, maybe at some point in the future. For now, it was wiser to humble himself. Even with all his new upgrades, Anthony elected to lay low and continue his routine of scouting and covering the area little by little. In a one-on-one fight against the wrong opponent, he would flat out lose without a contest. Thankfully, advanced stealth granted him newfound confidence to explore unfamiliar shafts. He felt a little more open to heading deeper into this place. Now, he could be more careful when it came to following pheromone trails. His curiosity about what lay below might finally be satisfied. If he didn't have his new upgrades, he probably wouldn't have touched the crater he discovered a few days ago. This time, however, he was feeling adventurous. He took a deep breath and strengthened his resolve. Moving straight down without a light source still made him nervous, but it was nothing he couldn't overcome. After all, this wasn't the kind of thing humans ever got the chance to do. He might as well take advantage of what an ant was capable of. Keeping his eyes peeled, he crawled along the rugged walls of the crater. He expected to be moving in pitch darkness. While that was true for the first part of the dive, as he reached a certain depth, the shaft actually started to light up. In fact, the mysterious glow grew ever so slightly brighter the farther down he went. Much to his surprise, he discovered plant life flourishing down in these barren caves. The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. Sunlight didn't reach this far down. Perhaps these plants had evolved to siphon magical veins for sustenance. Regardless, it was his first time seeing something genuinely beautiful in this god-forsaken place. While he was busy stopping to smell the flowers, his antennae picked up something that made them wriggle. Just like before, he detected faint traces of pheromones. And just like before, he got his hopes up, thinking that his clan, his tribe, his ant bros were nearby. He felt quite proud of himself for choosing the correct path, even if it had been scary. In his head, he cooked up a scenario where a mighty scout from his colony had originated somewhere down this crater and pursued the thieves who dared raid their home higher into the cave. Anthony would love to be praised for his diligence and boldness in surviving the harsh surface all on his own, right out of the egg. As he absent-mindedly followed the source of the pheromones, he came across yet another crossroad. The shaft ended abruptly, splitting into two tunnels. He refused to blindly barge around the corners of the deep. He was still a little traumatized by his run-in with the spider up above. Down here, there could be full-grown spider monsters or other horrors lurking in the shadows. For now, he'd take his chances with the wider, seemingly less death-inducing opening, just in case he needed to make a tactical retreat. Traversing the path, he came across a sight that made his jaw drop to the floor. Spread out before him was an impossible vista of luminous trees, grass, mushrooms, and all manner of vibrant plant life. He walked slowly through the bioluminescent forest, passing under the shade of glowing mushroom caps. Radiant flowers swayed alongside every blade of grass. It was so insane that Anthony had to ask Gandalf what the hell was going on. He never expected to stumble into such a flourishing ecosystem beneath a literal death trap. How could an underground space of this massive scale even exist? He couldn't even see the other side of the field. By his estimation, the ceiling alone looked to be about 60 meters high. But as the initial shock wore off, the fear of what might be lurking in the area quickly surfaced. If this place could support a thriving ecosystem, it had to be crawling with monsters. Still, one optimistic thought had his little ant heart in a tight grip. Somewhere in this massive cavern, his colony might exist. Perhaps he'd have to travel farther than he ever had before to find it. Maybe the scout he'd imagined really had passed through here on its way to the upper cave. At any rate, exploring the space seemed like a no-brainer, even if its sheer scale was a little demoralizing. The whole field was exotic and exciting, but it was hard to appreciate its beauty while completely clueless about what lived in such a massive open space. Could the monsters here be supersized? How much biomass could they pile up in a flourishing place like this? Shaking the useless hypotheticals out of his head, Anthony reminded himself to firm his resolve and think positively. After this initial scouting venture, he made it his goal to conquer this bizarre space and ultimately reunite with his colony. In the meantime, however, he decided to retreat higher up to grind some levels. There were still a few species he had yet to suck biomass out of. He justified the move as the most sensible strategy, trying to convince himself he wasn't just being a coward. Before throwing his lot into the unknown luminescent territory, it was better to conquer the known areas first. He vowed to raise his level and gain more mutations to prepare for exploring the mysterious space. Reframing his mindset got him fired up. After exiting the crater, he headed back to the temporary nest he'd been staying in for the past few days. Unlike before, he felt a little pressured by the passing of time. If his suspicions were correct, the main tunnel had to be connected to the cavern occupied by the human soldiers. Once they came down and expanded their reach, Anthony could kiss his EXP and biomass harvesting goodbye. He'd be forced to exclusively hunt down in the crater with zero intel. Taking every factor into account, He knew he had to move fast. It was necessary to throw a little caution to the wind and make some bold moves to expedite the process. Without more EXP and biomass for upgrades, a journey down the crater could spell a swift death. He activated stealth and got to hunting like he was running out of time. If he wanted to maximize his gains, targeting creatures he hadn't consumed yet was the way to do it. That way, he could secure the bonus points courtesy of Gandalf. Hunting a giant croc beast on his own was out of the question. They were far more terrifying than anything else in the area, practically apex predators. The most realistic targets were the slimy slug creatures. Anthony couldn't afford to sit around starving while studying their patterns, so he decided to wing it for once. Spotting one gave him the chance to look at it up close, and the creature looked even less appealing than he'd thought. This one was roughly twice his body length. It was just a long, slimy body topped with gnarly spines along its back, leaving a thick trail of mucus wherever it went. Its body presumably produced the disgusting substance to grease its path and increase its speed. Beyond that, Anthony could only speculate. For now, it was time to hit the thing with a surprise blast of acid. From above, he squirted a perfectly aimed blast right into the slug's tail end. Disappointingly, nothing happened. It appeared completely impervious to his chemical attack. The creature just kept sliding along, totally oblivious to the fact that it was being hunted. It seemed the mucous membrane protecting its body rendered his acid useless. If he tried a more physical approach, like biting, his mandibles would probably just get stuck. Of all the defenses this thing could employ, it just had to be a slime barrier. It was a perfect, outright disgusting counter to his entire kit. Even so, Anthony had one more advantage up his sleeve: the power and creativity of the human mind. Actually, the trick he had in mind was one even regular ants on Earth were capable of, and he'd already used it against the spiderwebs. Grabbing a rock with his mandibles, he took aim. He snuck up behind the slug, carefully concealing his presence. It was pretty easy considering how slowly the target was moving. Once he was close enough, he chucked the rock with full force to see how the slimy bastard would react. As expected, there was zero reaction. It wasn't even clear if the slug knew he was there. Anthony reactivated stealth and got to work. He grabbed rocks from all over the place and hurled them at the slug's body, figuring the dirt and stone would pile up and soak away the slime. After piling up a decent pile of rocks to hinder the slug's movement and drain its mucus, Anthony paused to see if he'd get a reaction. Relying on his advanced stealth, he positioned himself directly above the creature. His acid squirted out, clear as day, and fired with the reckless abandon of a teenage boy who had just discovered incognito mode. The slug definitely felt the sting as the hissing sound of melting membrane echoed through the cave. Anthony's plan had worked. He might have looked a little perverted doing it, but got the job done and dealt some solid damage. Hearing the sizzle and smelling the slug's burning flesh made him retch. Just when he thought this would be a free kill, the slimy bastard wriggled and turned in his direction. It made Anthony wonder how these slow monsters survived in such a barren hellhole. With no plants to feed on in the upper caves, that meant they had to be hunters. Fully locked in and ready for anything, Anthony dashed away before the slug could spot him. As the acid slowly burned away its slimy flesh, the slug frantically searched for the culprit, groaning in discomfort. When it finally sensed a presence nearby, the seemingly docile creature opened its maw, baring sharp fangs and letting out a blood-curdling roar. From that maw came a long-range attack aimed right at Anthony. Thankfully, the rock he'd chosen for cover provided enough defense. Judging by its properties, the substance looked like a sticky acid. Seeing it melt solid rock in the blink of an eye, Anthony knew it was leagues stronger than whatever he could shoot out of his backside. He'd been so distracted by the slug's impenetrable defenses that he hadn't even considered it might use its slime offensively. Staring down an acid-spitting nightmare, it was too late for regrets. Ants can't cry anyway. All he could do was commit to the bit and finish the slimy bastard off. The real problem was his dwindling ammo. Usually he could only fire 3 or 4 acid shots at a time, and he hadn't yet figured out exactly how long it took to regenerate a full load. If he kept firing now, there was no telling when he'd be able to reload. And fighting this thing in melee range with just his mandibles was completely out of the question. He'd get overpowered in seconds. At the end of the day, his acid was his only viable weapon. It had to land the decisive blow. Anthony felt like Gandalf had forsaken him, forcing him into a battle with a creature built to be the perfect counter to his entire arsenal. If he hadn't been in such a rush to get stronger, he never would have taken the risk. For now, the safest play was to keep a low profile and work his way from the ceiling down to the wall. Surprisingly, this cowardly maneuver leveled up his grip skill to level 4. Scrambling across walls and ceilings was what he did best. so it was a shock it had taken this long to reach that level. Meanwhile, the slug had picked up his trail and was already scaling the rocky walls. The battle was on, and the damn protective slime barrier was starting to regenerate. Based on the facts, this monster likely hunted by immobilizing and burning its prey with sticky acid before menacingly closing in to devour them. Anthony had the advantage when it came to speed, so he decided to test a strategy he'd just cooked up. Standing at his full height, he proudly presented his rear end to the slug. The slimy freak was thirsty for some back shots. Anthony danced and shook his dump truck to lure the slug closer. Apparently, even a monstrous 2-meter-long slug didn't quite know how to react to an ant wiggling its ass at it. Eventually, Mr. Slug ran out of patience, opening its jaws wide to blast Anthony with another shot of sticky acid. This was exactly what Anthony was aiming for. A wide-open mouth made for perfect target practice. Landing a critical hit that forced the slug to ingest his poison immediately upgraded his acid shot to level 4. It was a flawless strike that even Gandalf would approve of. Mr. Slug foamed at the mouth, clearly in agony. It was a solid, concentrated jet of death, and the reaction was immediate. The slug lost its grip on the wall and plummeted to the ground, crushing its spine on impact. Flawless plan and execution from the Wonder Ant. As the slug oozed disgusting goo from every pore, Anthony kept his distance, just in case he hadn't dealt fatal damage. He only relaxed when the system confirmed his victory over the level 4 Alcyonium slug, rewarding him with EXP. With the slimy freak gone limp, it looked like a 2-meter-long pile of dung. But with the hunt over, the hardest part was just beginning. He had to eat the corpse to harvest its biomass. If an ant could vomit, Anthony would be doing it right now. He mentally yelled at himself, trying to rationalize that people on Earth ate escargot all the time. Biomass was biomass, regardless of the source. The slime layer still coated the creature, but at least it had stopped producing the repulsive lube after its final breath. To speed up the drying process, he dug up some dirt to soak up the slime. Filling his mouth with dirt and dumping it onto the disgusting ooze wasn't exactly an appetizing start to a meal. It felt like a punishment, but he had to endure it for the sake of evolving and growing stronger. Once a decent chunk of the slug's body was relatively dry, Anthony took his first bite. The texture alone would have made the most adventurous eaters tap out, and the slime dressing certainly didn't help. Even so, Anthony pushed through without too many complaints. He switched up his approach with every bite, desperately searching for the most palatable part of the corpse. Halfway through this reluctantly exotic food trip, his belly felt like it was going to explode. Thankfully, the system showed mercy and awarded him the biomass from the slug. He couldn't stomach the rest of the remains right away, but since nutrients were hard to come by, he decided to bury it and save it for later. Time was limited, and he needed to pick up the pace. Moving faster naturally came with risks, so to mitigate them, upgrading his acid gland and primary weapon to +2 seemed like the smartest move. Mr. Slug had been a massive haul, but Anthony still had the energy to scout the tunnels for more opportunities. Not far from his kill zone, he spotted an old friend, the thorn lizard. Seeing another one of these guys made him feel a little nostalgic for his very first official hunt. His next prey was decided. This time he figured he could reuse some elements from his original strategy. Utilizing the wall terrain and his acid should be enough. Setting up a trap would waste too much time. A head-on clash using his acid and mandibles would be a great way to test his current combat limits. With his improved antennae and vision, nothing could escape his radar. He easily spotted the lizard tucked against a rock to rest. Anthony positioned himself directly above without making a sound. He only had enough juice left for 1 or 2 acid shots, so he had to make them count. Since the clueless lizard was resting, he managed to sneak within 5 meters without tripping any alarms, moving with the utmost patience. The last fight with Mr. Slug had been way too risky. This time, he had the luxury of stacking the odds heavily in his favor. The poor thorn lizard had no idea what was about to hit it from above. Like a tactical airstrike, Anthony dropped his acid directly onto his target's head, jolting it awake and sending it writhing in agony. It was his most accurate shot yet, a literal bullseye that blinded the lizard. The creature immediately panicked, thrashing around recklessly to dislodge the burning acid. Anthony stepped back to avoid getting needlessly stabbed or poisoned. His mandibles weren't a fantastic weapon yet. As a worker ant, they were built for digging and holding, not piercing or cutting. They might look terrifying up close, but they were entirely the wrong tool for the job. The teeth on the inside of his jaws were flat, unable to rip or tear into flesh. Some ants, like bull ants, boasted long, sharp, deadly mandibles. Then there were trap-jaw ants, equipped with powerful locking muscles that coiled like a spring before slamming shut like a rat trap. Lacking that kind of biological potential, Anthony's bites felt more like an aggressive squeeze than a shredding attack. A single bite wouldn't do much damage, but this was the perfect opportunity to see exactly how many upgrades he needed. Since he lacked quality, he planned to make up for it with sheer quantity. Straddling the lizard like a jockey on a racehorse, he launched an all-out biting frenzy on the back of its neck. The prey tried desperately to shake him off, but his grip was too ironclad to break. The more he bit, the more pain he inflicted, driving the blinded lizard utterly insane. After countless weak but relentless bites, the lizard finally croaked, and his bite skill reached level 4. The gamble had paid off, rewarding him with a hefty upgrade. Anthony felt incredibly proud of himself. He had defeated the thorn lizard through sheer grit and perseverance. Up on the surface, Commander Titus was stuck in his office, buried under mountains of paperwork for the endless preparations required before the big expedition. Peace and quiet had been hard to come by these last few days. The Queen's decision to lend assistance by providing the royal guards was unexpected but immensely helpful. His legionaries had only anticipated regular frontline soldiers to plug the gap in their numbers. Though capable, the regulars paled in comparison to the quality and discipline of the royal guards. The moment they arrived at the dungeon, everything flowed smoothly, and preparations accelerated. Things really started to move when the Queen's name was involved. Looking at his desk, Titus wondered if he could find more stone wood once he re-entered the dungeon. It had a wonderful dark fleck texture. In his younger years, he had carried a single slab of it on his back all the way up to the surface to craft his office desk. To this day, he had never found a more perfect material. Since he built the furniture himself, Titus had included a secret switch that opened a hidden compartment. Hidden inside that hollow space were vials filled with a radiant blue liquid. He sighed and rolled up his sleeve to reveal a curious tattoo. At first glance, it looked like a magic formation branded directly into his skin. He grabbed one of the vials and poured its contents directly onto the center of the formation. When the blue liquid made contact with his tattoo, it lit up and absorbed the fluid. Titus gritted his teeth, clearly in agony from the strange substance. After emptying the vial, he remained seated at his desk, enduring the grueling process. After what felt like an eternity, the pain slowly subsided. He placed the empty vial back into the hollow compartment. He had gone through half of his supply now. After he carefully closed the hidden stash, the desk looked like a perfectly normal piece of furniture once more. Now that he was done dosing himself, it was time to get back to where a good legionary belonged. The dungeon. He grabbed the mighty axe that had been hanging idle in his office for far too long. It was time to get the old thing sharpened again. A good soldier always ensured his blade was properly prepped for action. Down in the dungeon area the legionaries dubbed the Newbie Cave, soldiers were transporting tied-up prisoners inside. The level 35 fire mage and the level 30 ranger that Anthony had scrapped with a while ago discussed the situation amongst themselves. They had no idea why they were bringing prisoners down into this dangerous place. One thing was for sure, though. None of those prisoners were going back to the surface alive. All Ranger Mirren knew was that the induction ceremony took place somewhere deep within the dungeon. The veteran legionaries never spoke about what actually went down during the induction. The Deep Legion had a history spanning 3,000 years. They were shrouded in mystery, and most people knew very little about this private army that had once saved civilization. No matter. Mirren would soon become a full-time legionary herself. The Legion's secrets would be her secrets, and she was ready to guard them with her life. Here in the Newbie Cave, Mirren and the fire mage, Donnellan, were tasked with observing how dungeon mercs hunted. Those dumbasses mostly fumbled around the danger zones and got themselves hurt. They never bothered to remember that dungeon monsters were completely different from the ones on the surface. These merc jocks were just a constant nuisance to the Legion. They always overextended themselves for the sake of grinding levels, never caring about the rescue teams that constantly had to bail them out. They always bit off more than they could chew and never learned their lesson. Out of nowhere, a Legion tribune approached Mirren and Donnellan. She asked if they were ready for the expedition. Mirren respectfully answered that their equipment and armor had been checked and polished, but the tribune wasn't talking about their gear. She was asking if they were mentally prepared for what was to come. In this place, the commander or a tribune like her could mess up just once, and it would be game over. Donnellan and Mirren were locked in for a promotion once they ventured down below. It was a momentous occasion that every legionary treasured. Even so, they couldn't let the festivities become a distraction. In a few hours they would start sweeping the upper area clean to set up the forward camp in the forest expanse. Meanwhile, back to Anthony's grind. A furiously busy day of hunting and filling his belly had just passed. As expected, taking on greater risks brought him greater rewards. Circumstances had forced him to be more aggressive, and it had certainly paid off. Eager to check his progress and his incredible bounty, he opened his status window. After reluctantly consuming the crunchy thorn lizard and the remaining slimy coral slug meat, he had banked 2 biomass points. Once he was full, he continued hunting and chanced upon another isolated coral slug to munch on. After positioning himself in an advantageous spot, he repeated the trick he had used to deal with the first slug. The purple coral slug was not immune to his expert rage-baiting technique. As soon as it opened its mouth to attack with sticky acid, Anthony sprayed the freak with his own hot sticky liquid. Shooting inside the mouth guaranteed an instant critical hit. He messed up the timing a little bit though, and ended up getting sprayed by the acidic mucus the monster projected. Having sticky goop blasted onto his body was bad enough, but the burn chunked his HP by 10. A section of his back carapace and thorax was partially melted. After recovering to full health not too long ago, he was forced right back into the red zone. Even a partial burn took out 1/3 of his health. If it had covered more of his body, it would have been life-threatening. At that moment, he felt severely tempted to focus on upgrading his carapace to bolster his flimsy defenses, but there were so many high-priority parts that needed upgrading. After dragging out the battle of attrition with the utmost precaution, he managed to kill the purple coral slug. Consuming the slug regenerated a good bit of HP, bringing his health bar back into the green. After the disgusting meal, he felt mostly restored to a picture of ant perfection. Looking at his upgrade menu, a few basic skills were in the running for priority. Still, he couldn't pass up the chance to improve his most effective weapon. Acid Shot could now be upgraded to Improved Acid Shot. A leap in quality would improve its accuracy and increase its range. With the range boost, he could make more reliable shots from a greater distance. It was a no-brainer. It drastically improved his safety, as well as his ability to output reliable damage. Hungry for more skill points, he hunted a lone wolf lizard and opened with his bread-and-butter combo Stealth plus Acid Shot. After that kill, a lot of his skills were converging on level 4. It would be great if he had the points to upgrade them all, as missing out on EXP would be a tragedy. Now came the tricky bit, managing his scarce biomass. If possible, he wanted to continue upgrading his eyesight to level 4. Superior vision against other monsters had been critical in allowing him to spot and locate juicy, isolated prey. It also gave him peace of mind against being sneak attacked from his blind spots. That sensory advantage could never be lost, or he might find himself in a deadly croc beast ambush, or something worse. Vision was great all around, but in order to farm more biomass, directly improving his combat level meant going all in on Acid Shot. Afterward, he would be left with 1 extra biomass to spend on either his legs, carapace, or mandibles. All of them would help his general capabilities. A +1 to his legs would make him more mobile, which would be helpful for scouting, retreating, chasing, and fighting. Leveling up his mandibles didn't sound too appealing at the moment. They simply required too much biomass investment to yield tangible results. For now, the 2 viable paths were +4 eyes, or +3 acid glands and +1 legs. His cautious nature made him lean toward the defensive route. He'd be moving into a new environment soon, and having every possible advantage was key to survival. After much deliberation, Anthony finally purchased the upgrade for his eyes at the cost of 4 biomass. Just like before, his eyes were assaulted by unimaginable pain. He rolled around on the floor, trying his best not to scratch his own eyeballs out. They were literally growing and stretching inside his eye holes. His carapace shifted to make way for their new shape. Anthony prayed to Gandalf to make the torture stop. Mutations were amazing, but the process could only have been created by a cruel god. After what felt like forever, the burning pain finally subsided. His eyesight had qualitatively improved, and his peripheral vision had expanded quite a bit. It wasn't perfect, but the current Anthony was miles ahead of the clueless baby ant reborn in Panganjera not too long ago. Soon he might be able to reunite with the colony. He could feel it in his gut. For now, harvesting more EXP and biomass as efficiently as possible was the continuing goal. That meant hunting down new targets for the bonus biomass they granted. Since he was now fully rested, it might be time to take on one of those blade-tailed rats. Isolating one of those rodents might be tough, though. On his way to the main tunnel, his antennae picked up faint vibrations from a disturbance up ahead. If it was another fight between monsters, he stood to gain some lucky points. With newfound optimism, he made his way toward the commotion. Just a few days after the Croc Beast and Centipede War, Anthony came across a battle between 4 of the usual suspects and 3 wolves. It was intense and bloody. Though outnumbered, the wolves made up the deficit with pure ferocity. Unbeknownst to both parties, a young invisible ant was lurking on the ceiling, waiting to drop some sticky stuff at exactly the right moment. First, he moved stealthily and slightly farther away to get a better angle. This was the perfect time to take advantage of his new skills. After being deadlocked for a few minutes, both sides broke apart to size each other up from a distance. One wrong twitch, and the conflict would undoubtedly reignite at a moment's notice. The fire of fury in both parties was intense, but they were cautious. It was up to Anthony to stir the pot a little by taking a shot. The first victim of his acid shot was a centipede. He had a lot of history with those critters, so it was only fitting to light a fire under their asses. Almost immediately, the hounds took advantage of the break in the enemy formation caused by his spray. One of them focused solely on the wounded centipede coiling in pain. Cut off from its allies' support, the wolf didn't give a rat's ass about the injured centipede's empty threats, leaping forward like a rabid animal. In response, the centipede squirted an acid shot of its own to knock the hound off balance. Neither side was giving the other any time to catch their breath. The centipede tried to close the gap with a sneak attack, but was completely thwarted by the hound's spiked tail. Watching from the best seat in the house, Anthony was stunned by the savagery of the fight. He imagined himself down there fighting the hounds. If he were hit by that tail, he'd be squashed into a pancake. No doubt about it. It was a scary thought, but a scarier reality. The injured centipede wasn't faring too well under the hound's relentless assault. Eventually, it was clawed to the ground, never to skitter around again. The look on the wolf's face was proud, as if it were thinking that a mere bug shouldn't dare threaten the greatness of a hound. But before it could use its tail to deal the finishing blow, something unexpected happened. Anthony sprayed the hound with copious amounts of acid, melting its fur and burning its flesh. He laughed mischievously from the safety of his stealth. It wasn't exactly honorable to interrupt the wolf's proud moment, but he had to do what he had to do. Of course, a single blast of acid wasn't nearly enough to finish off something as big and mighty as a hound. The same was also true for the centipedes. The war between the 2 powerful species had reached a critical moment. With one centipede out of the picture, the battle had become quite even. The insects seemed a little unwilling to proceed after losing their numbers advantage, but the hounds were pumped to continue now that the momentum was on their side. To humble the proud canines a little, Anthony splashed the hound leading the pack with an acid shot. The upgrade to his biological artillery was on full display. It made the hound stumble and collapse to the ground, thrashing and roaring in pain. Seeing the helpless dog, the centipedes advanced to seize their chance. They used their claws to grab and restrain the dog, shutting down its deadly fangs. The many-legged freaks used their long bodies to constrict and crush their snarling foe. No matter how hard the hound thrashed, the claws holding him down drew blood, and the stingers delivered lethal poison all over his body. While he still had the chance, Anthony decided to abandon the ceiling and head toward the outskirts of the brawl. One of the hounds was being strangled, pinched, and poisoned to death, but the other dogs had backed off. There wasn't a single pause in the carnage. With everyone distracted by finishing off their foes, Anthony was free to get close to the half-dead centipede. After a few chomps from his mandibles, the thing would definitely die. He demonstrated the strength of his level 4 mandibles, breaking the skin in one bite and letting the blood spurt. The final hit gave him more EXP, and he was free to drag his prey away. The battle he had directly influenced was reaching its climax. The crawlers were homed in on killing the hound. The 3 remaining centipedes were clearly giving it their all for the sake of survival, lashing out with their poisoned spikes to ward off the remaining hounds. Even when weakened by poison, the strength of the hound's spiked tail could never be underestimated. It swatted the persistent insects away, making them crash against the cavern walls and stunning them into immobility. Several of their legs and claws were shattered. Both parties had sustained severe injuries and were barely able to put up a fight. Now they were just circling each other, waiting for an easy opening to exploit. As if a hidden starter gun had gone off, the remaining monsters lunged at each other, latching onto and coiling around their foes. Anthony quietly watched from the sidelines. It was like a miniature kaiju battle. By the end of the fight, neither the centipedes nor the hounds had enough strength to keep going. They fell to the floor at the exact same time. Both sides collapsed, completely spent and down for the count. Anthony was free to walk right into the bloody aftermath of the all-out war. All of the creatures were on the verge of death, entirely unable to defend themselves. It was horrible news for them, but it was like Christmas for our ant boy. He patted himself on the back for making stronger monsters dance right into the grip of his mandibles. He was like a master conductor at a symphony. All of these helpless idiots, clinging to a sliver of health, were basically a free farm for an unprecedented EXP and biomass harvest. The Lupus Draco cubs ranged from level 3 to 4, while the Claw centipedes were around level 2 to 3. They each gave Anthony varied amounts of EXP, but it all added up to more than he had ever harvested before. This made his EXP bar shoot to the moon, hitting the level cap and unlocking the evolution menu. The system notification was music to his ears. Anthony dropped down to his many knees and prayed in thanks to Gandalf. After dealing the final hits, it was time to munch on some dead meat. He nibbled just enough out of every carcass to slurp up the juicy biomass. He had been hearing something, though, a sound that kept growing louder. He needed to consume like a glutton to maximize his harvest, but for some reason, he had a terrible feeling that the sound was heading his way, biting into the meat of the Lupus Draco cub, a new creature yet to be unlocked in his profile portfolio, granted him bonus biomass. When they grew up, they became fearsome wolf dragons. Anthony wanted to stay for another hour, or even just 10 minutes, but the sound of marching, stomping boots was getting louder. He wanted to take some to go, but he had already consumed enough meat to equal an entire wolf dragon, and his stomach was about to burst. Right then and there, he remembered reading something in his ant research back on Earth. Some ants actually had 2 stomachs. Scouts and workers didn't always carry prey back to the colony in their jaws. Sometimes they ate and filled up their so-called social stomach. Once back at the nest, they regurgitated the food they had collected. It was a bit disgusting, but highly practical. Some workers even became living storage containers, swelling to ridiculous sizes for the sake of feeding the colony. If Anthony's personal stomach was filled to the brim, maybe it was time to access his social stomach. Ignoring the stomping sounds, he indulged in a second round of feasting to accumulate more biomass. The dead centipedes and hounds were absolutely devoured, their meat and innards chomped away by his mandibles. Completely immersed in his feast, Anthony was snapped back to reality by the sight of lamplight moving closer to his position. He immediately took off. All his gains would have been for nothing if he got caught by humans. The meat in both of his stomachs weighed him down, slowing his escape. Upon reaching the edge of the wall, he pushed his limbs to the limit, engaged his grip, and climbed. Despite the heavy difficulty of moving, he refused to look back out of fear, though he could hear the human soldiers ripping the remains of the creatures apart below. His nest was only 10 meters away. Surely he'd get there before he was spotted. The humans were starting to come into view right beneath his position. Their presence was bringing more monsters out of hiding to resist the invasion. No matter how dominant the claw centipedes and wolf dragons were in this ecosystem, they were no match for the coordinated attacks of humans. Blades, magic, and arrows easily overpowered uncontrolled savagery. Cloaking himself in stealth, Anthony hauled his fat ass up the damn wall. The cavern echoed with the sounds of casting spells, whistling arrows, and swinging swords. An absolute one-sided slaughterfest. Thankfully, he managed to reach his tunnel undetected. Since he couldn't use the main entrance, he had to take the dirt wall. He'd prepped this escape route beforehand, but his ass had gotten way too fat to fit through the tiny hole. With far too much junk in his trunk to squeeze through, Anthony pulled with all his might, but he was more stuck than a stepsister in a washing machine. After expending the last of his strength, he finally popped out of the hole, face-planting hard in the process. Now was the time to spend his biomass and haul his ass down the crater. For 4 biomass, he upgraded his acid glands to +3 and his legs to +1. Just like his vision upgrades, mutating his acid glands felt exactly like the world's worst, most agonizingly fiery diarrhea. The sensation was horrific, but he couldn't afford to stay still. Plummeting to his death right after reaching the crater wasn't exactly on his to-do list. With his added weight, every step needed solid support. Hopefully, the 1-level upgrade to his legs would give him the strength to handle the extra bulk. The descent into the pitch-black crater was incredibly treacherous. He survived a handful of close calls, his upgraded legs struggling to keep his grip on the sheer walls. Halfway down, a massive explosion rocked the entire dungeon, raining debris down the shaft. Those humans must have blown up a nearby dirt wall, which meant they were already past his nest and zeroing in on the crater. Throwing caution to the wind, Anthony skittered straight down as fast as his legs could carry him. Lingering near the blast zone was a death sentence. The humans were bound to climb down after him, and he only had time for one crucial task. Thankfully, he hit the bottom without any major incidents. It was an exhausting, nerve-wracking descent. but he'd made it. He immediately opened the system and accessed the evolution menu. Along with a congratulatory message, the system presented him with a massive choice. He could evolve into a mature worker ant, effectively staying a formica, or branch out and condense a monster core. The mature worker ant route offered a straightforward linear path to increase stats and new skills. On the flip side, condensing a monster core would grant him MP and empower custom evolutions. Advancing as an adult worker ant offered the safest, most immediate boost to his survival, but the monster core opened the door to a world of magic. Thoroughly hooked by the second option, he didn't hesitate to choose the riskier path. Anthony blacked out for who knows how long. When he finally forced his eyes open, the first thing he noticed was a boiling ball of heat radiating inside his thorax, likely his newly spawned monster core. He dragged himself to his feet, sluggish and weakened from the evolution. He couldn't stay here long. The soldiers were still right above him. At any second, those humans could drop down the crater to investigate. Despite his exhaustion, he had to keep moving. While on the run, he pulled up his status window to check the changes. His heart sank, his level had plummeted, and his stats had taken a massive downgrade. He cursed Gandalf for resetting him back to level 1. All his hard work, hunting, and accumulated experience had gone up in smoke. Every ounce of ridiculous luck and every opportunity he'd fought for had been wiped clean. Surviving this far hadn't been easy, and a total reset felt entirely unjustified. But once he calmed down and took a closer look at his status, he spotted the silver lining. The MP menu was finally unlocked, sitting pretty at 10 instead of 0. His hunch had been spot on. A monster core was the vital ingredient for creatures like him to master magic. It perfectly explained why the monsters upstairs were so drawn to that magic-rich pool, treating it as a strict conflict-free neutral zone. By drinking the water, they absorbed mana to speed up the formation of their own cores. Though he'd basically taken a shortcut to form his core, sacrificing so many stats just for 10 MP stung bitterly. To make matters worse, he was now forced to navigate even more dangerous territory without the very stats that would have kept him alive. He tried tapping into his MP to manipulate some loose leaves, but nothing happened. If he'd made the wrong choice, he was completely screwed. Still, the prospect of wielding magic was just too enticing to pass up. He'd just have to live with his decision. With any luck, this path would eventually let him fight the monsters he usually had to run from. Being considered unevolved again meant he could rack up levels and skill points much faster. He purposely avoided looking at his skills menu, terrified of seeing mana shaping or spell chanting and giving in to temptation. For now, his priority was exploring this vast, unknown underground floor. At first glance, the ceiling looked to be a good 60 to 70 meters high. He flat out refused to climb something that tall right now. One slip meant certain death. Besides, even at +4, his eyesight still wasn't sharp enough to see the far ends of the walls. Being an insect, he didn't have regular human eyes, he had compound eyes. Because of this, his vision lacked a single point of focus. Unlike humans who could stare at one specific spot in high definition, compound eyes allowed him to look in multiple directions at once, just with much poorer detail. Reminded of that limitation, he felt completely vindicated in his choice to heavily invest in mutating his vision to +5. Maybe Gandalf would drop a hint about what happens when mutations reach insane levels. Unfortunately, God didn't seem too keen on listening to his requests lately. His prayers were met with absolute crickets. It was as if the great Gandalf's only response was a giant shrug. A little advice would have been nice, especially in such an unfamiliar environment. The landscape stretched out like a scene straight from an alien planet, cementing the fact that he really was in another world. Anthony's adventurous nature took over as he roamed the underground grasslands freely, chasing after every little thing that caught his eye like an excitable kid. When he stumbled across a bizarre mushroom, he naturally tried taking a bite. He immediately spat it out. Just putting the damn thing in his mouth chipped away at his HP, and the bite mark he left behind started oozing some sort of acidic sap. If he took damage just from chomping on a mushroom, what else in this hellhole could kill him? He made a firm mental note, never touch, let alone bite, random things down here. Right now, he needed to put some distance between himself and the crater in case the soldiers stormed the area. Once he was far enough away, he'd dig a secure hiding spot to retreat into. He idly wondered if there were any other creatures down here, and immediately jinxed himself. Without warning, massive bird monsters descended from the ceiling, their wings flapping with sharp, rattling screeches. Their target? The giant claw centipedes chilling on the ground. Those bastards might have been terrifying predators in the upper caves, but down here, They were just another snack. Anthony watched in horror as a foe he would have fought tooth and nail to survive was scooped up like a free gummy worm. Scurrying to hide under the mushroom caps, he had to admit he might have been a little overconfident. With his upgraded skills and new monster core, he genuinely thought he'd be top dog, ready to explore this foreign expanse without fear. Clearly, that was a delusion. If a massive centipede got snatched up that effortlessly, a little ant like him was sitting dead last at the bottom of the food chain. The evolved, apex versions of the creatures he knew definitely lived down here. It simply wasn't fair. He had no colony to rely on for safety. If he'd just bitten the bullet and evolved into a mature worker ant, his body would be 3 meters long and 2 feet thick by now. Still, he had to live with his choices. He always knew the creatures down here were bound to be vastly stronger. He'd accepted that reality when he chose the tedious path of condensing a monster core. As long as he relied on his stealth and upgraded senses, he still had a decent shot at survival. Keeping his invisibility active, he studied the strange, flourishing foliage of trees and giant fungi. Much like the subterranean flowers he'd seen before, these trees clearly didn't need sunlight to thrive. They sprouted strangely fleshy leaves instead. Until he was 100% certain these trees weren't just giant, disguised ant traps, it was best to play it safe and avoid touching them. Suddenly, a distant disturbance interrupted his aimless wandering. This time, however, he refused to just cower under the mushrooms. It was time to gather intel. Like a stalking panther, Anthony kept his posture low as he crept through the alien forest. Working in perfect sync, his compound eyes and antennae quickly pinpointed the exact location of the disturbance. Walking around with his advanced stealth toggled on, the skill breached the XP threshold and leveled up. It had taken an unusually long time to reach this level. Advanced skills required more use before they could be upgraded. Regardless, it happened at the perfect time. He had just found what he was looking for. Up ahead was a croc beast, a gravely injured one. Thankfully, this one hadn't evolved yet, and the massive gash on its body was sapping its energy. Seeing the beast up close, Anthony was terrified. It was the first monster he had ever seen upon reincarnating after all. Back then, it had been gleefully eating an ant alive. It was a traumatizing first impression. If ants could dream and have nightmares, this reptilian monster would be in his. Focusing back on the present, this particular croc beast had evidently been involved in some heavy fighting. As long as he could play this correctly, this could be a golden opportunity sent by the heavens. There were no other creatures around, and the croc was slowly fading. It was time to put his fears behind him and seize the bonus biomass he had to forego before. Anthony valiantly jumped out of the foliage. He turned his fat ass in midair and took aim. Once locked in, he squirted a hefty acid shot, deliberately targeting the open wound. It sounded a bit cruel, but it was a weak spot that he could exploit. The croc beast snarled in pain as its wound was coated with the corrosive substance. Most of it breached the wound and burned its insides. It was naturally furious that a little ant would dare to take advantage of its weakness. Refusing to let up, Anthony shot another load, spewing his acid head-on. He forced the croc to take a big gulp of his acid, corroding its mouth, tongue, and throat. If these dumbass monsters kept letting him fire acid into their mouths, it might just become his signature move. Maybe he would call it the Anthony mouth shot. The ant got a chill. He immediately realized that the name could be misconstrued in a very dirty way. Anyway, the croc was now recklessly thrashing and growling, desperate to stop the pain. Today was clearly the croc's worst day. It had gotten into a deadly scuffle and survived only to get trolled by a little insect. Anthony thought 2 shots would do the job, but it was more resilient than expected. The croc beast went down on all fours and started chasing after him like an unhinged beast. The desperate dash was brutal. Anthony was at a complete disadvantage when it came to speed. When the croc got close enough, it slashed down with its sharp claw. He barely dodged out of the way with a clumsy jump. If that had connected, it would have been lights out for sure. Trying his best to remain level-headed, Anthony decided to make one last stand against his nightmare matchup. Since his back was already turned and his ass was perfectly angled, he squirted one more acid shot. Unfortunately, the croc was clever enough to predict his only damaging move, easily moving away from the splash zone. The croc might have looked like a brute, but it was smarter than it appeared. It continued chasing after Anthony, grabbing every chance to hurl an attack with murderous intent oozing from its every pore. Each claw strike was too close for comfort. If he got nicked by a single one of those sharp things, it was wraps. He couldn't keep rolling the dice on a 50 to 50% chance of going left or right. The only way out was through. Instead of running away, he turned around and ran at the reptile head-on. The descending claw nicked one of his antennae, ripping it off cleanly. It was a painful blow, painful enough to make him nauseous, but he had endured worse. Backing out was out of the question. He had to double down. With pure desperation, he bit into the croc's left leg as hard as he could with his mandibles. This way he could knock the beast off balance. Biting into the tough scales skyrocketed his bite skill to level 5, opening the upgrade path to crushing. Bite at the cost of 1 skill point. He didn't waste a moment and mentally slammed the confirm button. Before the croc could retreat, he wanted to put everything on the line in one final attempt. Unlike the first bite that had barely broken through the scales, the second one produced an audible crunch and drew the reptile's cold blood. Anthony tried to hold on, but he was slapped by the croc's tail. He slammed into a nearby rock, the impact knocking his soul out of his body.
And that's where we wrap up today's video. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss out the next video. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, leave your comment down below. Also, don't forget to drop a like to support our channel and subscribe to stay updates everything that comes out. See you next time. Bye bye and big hug to everyone. I am out.